Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Extended Day Ahead Market Revised Straw Proposal Stakeholder Meeting. My name is Isabella Nicosia, representing ISO Stakeholder Affairs, and I'll be facilitating the web conference today. As a reminder, these materials are available out on the initiative webpage.
Is now unmuted.
Ignore that, Isabella. My apologies.
Okay. As a reminder, these materials are available out on the initiative webpage. You can get to that page by going to kaiso.com. You'll want to go to the Stay Informed tab, click on Policy Initiatives, and that'll take you to the main initiative landing page where you'll be able to scroll down and find the Extended Day Ahead Market Stakeholder Initiative webpage as well. So before we get started, I just have a couple reminders. Again, this call is being recorded for informational and convenience purposes only, and any related transcriptions should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. If you need technical assistance at any time during today's call, you can send a chat to the event producer. His name is Marvin. So today we are going to revisit the GHG accounting topic that we left off on last Thursday. And then after that, we'll move into the topics we didn't get to, so transfer revenue and congestion revenue allocation, and then settlements, and we'll wrap up today with the EDAM fees framework. So with that, I will hand it over to Miloš Bosanek, our Regional Market Sector Manager from Market and Infrastructure Policy, and he will have some opening remarks for us. So Miloš.
Good morning. Thank you, Isabella, and good morning, everybody, and thanks for joining us for another round of EDAM discussions. Looks like my video is a bit bright, but we really appreciate all of you hanging with us here. This is, I think, our fourth meeting, and I'm expecting that we'll finish out the rest of the topics that are in the revised straw proposal. We met on the 29th, virtual discussion where we got through a number of topics, and then we had last week on the 7th and the 8th, we had an in-person discussion on a number of the EDAM key design items. And today we're really looking to finish out the rest of the revised straw proposal leading up to the submission of comments on the 26th of September. So we really appreciate all of you hanging here with us. We're going to cover GHG transfer revenue and congestion revenue allocation settlements, as well as EDAM fees framework. We'll talk about some of the next steps and workshops that we're planning on settlements in particular, but we really also want to get your feedback on additional topics that we need to workshop, and we look forward to your comments that will help inform some of those discrete elements that we need to walk through before the next iteration of the proposal. So thank you all again for joining us, and I'll turn it over to Anya to walk us through the GHG discussion.
All right, thanks so much, Miloš, and good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us early. I'm going to start today's discussion with a quick recap on last week's EDAM meeting on greenhouse gas accounting before delving back into the content to finish the presentation and hear your comments and questions. Last Thursday, I provided an overview of KAISO's rationale for starting with the resource-specific approach. I discussed the approaches that were included in the revised straw proposal and started discussing some of the aspects of the resource-specific approach. We did hear feedback on the flexibility of the resource-specific model in the future, not for day one of EDAM, to include constraints to limit fuel types or emission factors above a threshold for areas that regulate carbon without a price. We heard clarification questions on the greenhouse gas baseline, or what we're calling the greenhouse gas reference path. And we also received questions on the issue of double regulation costs, the issue that because Washington and California are unlinked based on CARB and ecology's definitions, if a greenhouse gas region bids into another greenhouse gas region, they'd be including the cost of carbon compliance, both in their energy bid and including a greenhouse gas bid adder to serve the other greenhouse gas regulation area. As part of that discussion at last week's meeting, the issue came up questioning if there was a market solution. And as we reflected in the revised straw proposal and in last week's meeting, this was really an issue for state and regulators to work out. Sorry about that. I do want to note we do have CARB with us this morning to speak to the issue. And with that, Marvin, could we unmute Rachel Goldline to comment on how CARB is thinking about the issue of double regulation costs?
Rachel has been unmuted.
Checking if my audio is working here.
And yes, we can hear you now.
Okay, great. Thank you, Anya. We wanted to note here for everyone that this is an issue that CARB is aware of. We are aware of these concerns. They are issues that say exist outside of the EDAM itself more generally, and CARB has been working to identify some potential pathways to address these concerns, and we're in close coordination with Washington Department of Ecology. As we've indicated in the past, any changes to CARB's regulation are going to occur in a future rulemaking that will be publicly noticed. So you can look forward to more details in the future. I don't have details about when that will be, but that would be publicly noticed. So I hope that helps at least provide some context for how state regulators are thinking about this issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rachel. And just as a quick pause, do folks have any questions on the line at this time? All right, I'm not seeing any hands raised unless you are Isabella or Marvin. So let's go ahead and jump back into the slides on slide 16. So one of the last topics we touched on was the GHG reference pass or the counterfactual. I know that we started this discussion. There were a lot of great clarification questions, but I'd like to kind of go back to this topic to hear from stakeholders on what issues might need further clarity in the draft final proposal, and also hear if kind of some of your thoughts have either changed or questions have been refined on this topic. So let me start out by saying that we have a greenhouse gas counterfactual in the first place to help approximate what dispatch would be without a greenhouse gas cost. And then once the market runs with greenhouse gas costs included, we're assessing how a greenhouse gas pricing policy impacted primary and secondary dispatch so that states can account for their atmospheric impact. The greenhouse gas reference pass is the baseline or counterfactual for each BAA, and that baseline run or GHG reference pass would occur in a market pass ahead of the day-ahead market run or IFM. GHG reference pass is approximating how a BAA is going to meet their own load with internal generation and assuming economic displacement with BAA to BAA transfers. It does not include greenhouse gas bids, which mean there isn't any greenhouse gas attribution or greenhouse gas transfers in the import direction. It's in the IFM or day-ahead market run where we're optimally scheduling transfers between BAAs to reflect optimal dispatch in the EDAM footprint, and this would include the greenhouse gas costs of compliance. So let's pause here for questions, and I see Mark Coleman has his hand up, and Stuart Kelly, and Alva.
Hi, good morning. It's Mark Holman with PowerX. Thanks for that. I guess my first question, I have two questions. The first question is, for the resource specific, you've talked about this counterfactual run and then having an export limit, but it seems that some of the documents, the language seems to have shifted a little bit. Is the export limit, in terms of what can be deemed, is it based on the export quantity above the counterfactual or the export capability of the BA? In other words, if a BA has 200 megawatts of exports, but 1,000 megawatts of export capability, can it be deemed delivered for 200 or 1,000? It seems to have shifted in your documents a little bit. In some places it says it'll be limited to export capability, and other places it says it'll be limited to actual exports.
All right, it sounds like George might be taking this.
Yeah, thank you, Anya. This is George Angelidis with the ASO. So the answer to this is the limit is actually dynamically imposed by what clears as a net transfer export from that BAA in the IFM, right, where we actually calculate the greenhouse gas attribution. So, you know, if 700 megawatts is the net export of the BAA, the net export transfer, then you won't have more than 700 megawatt worth of aggregate greenhouse gas attribution to resources in that BAA.
Thank you, George. So my example, it was 200. I appreciate that, and I know these things are moving very fast. Just be helpful, because I think one of your slides in a past presentation said it'd be limited to export capability. What you just described is it would be limited to its actual dispatched exports. I think that brings up, thanks for that. My second question is really an example, and the one that we're struggling with is you are not limiting it to the incremental production above the counterfactual. So I'll use a very simple example. If you've got a BA with 3,000 megawatts of emitting resources, coal or gas, and 3,000 megawatts of hydro, and you run your counterfactual to serve their load, and the counterfactual dispatches 2,000 megawatts of the coal or gas and 2,000 megawatts of the hydro. So you're serving the 4,000 megawatts of load with 2,000 megawatts of coal or gas and 2,000 megawatts of hydro in the counterfactual, and there's no exports. And then you run the market, and it dispatches up the coal by 1,000 megawatts. Won't your software deem that to come from the hydro? It'll allow the coal to be dispatched and deem it to come from the hydro, because you're not limiting what can be identified as the specific resource to its production above the counterfactual?
Well, it depends. It depends on how much available capacity is still bid into the market from the hydro.
Yeah, so the coal,
yeah.
Example I gave, there's 1,000 megawatts of upward space on the coal, 1,000 megawatts of upward space on the hydro. They both have 2,000 megawatts of production in the counterfactual. Aren't you just going to enable the dispatch of coal, but deem it to come from the hydro that didn't increase its production and would have ran anyways to serve load in the local BA?
Okay, let me get the answer to this question, because it's important to find out the result here. So, how much available capacity is being in the market from the hydro above the counterfactual? Is there still available capacity on the hydro above the counterfactual?
There's available capacity. So again, 4,000 megawatts of load. We have 3,000 megawatts of coal, 3,000 megawatts of hydro. In the counterfactual, you dispatch the coal for 2,000 megawatts to its min-gen. You dispatch the hydro to 2,000 megawatts, let's say, to its min-gen. It's got 1,000 megawatts of upward capability. The coal's got 1,000 megawatts of upward capability, but the coal's offer price is lower. Won't the software continue to dispatch coal, but deem it to come from hydro that's not increasing its production above the counterfactual?
All right. So we have 1,000 megawatts of available capacity in the market above the counterfactual, both for the hydro and another 1,000 from the coal in your example. Yes. Because out of the 3,000, 2,000 was in the counterfactual. Assuming that all of that capacity is having a greenhouse gas bid adder, all right, that all of this is willing to serve load, let's say, in California, then the algorithm will co-optimize between energy dispatch based on the energy bid for serving load outside of California and energy bid plus the emission cost plus the greenhouse gas bid, which presumably is zero for the hydro, for serving load in California. You can have a total, without the export constraint, you can have a total of potentially 2,000 megawatts of greenhouse gas attribution because you have a total of 1,000 plus 1,000 greenhouse gas bids, right? Now, which is going to clear depends on how the energy bid of hydro compares with the energy bid of coal, all right? If the energy bid of hydro is higher than the energy bid of coal plus the emission cost plus the greenhouse gas bid from the coal, yes, the optimization will clear the coal, but this is very unusual. Right?
So, George, let's say that the energy bid from the coal is at $30 plus $30 of emissions cost. But the energy bid of the hydro is at $40 plus $0 emissions. I believe that your solution will dispatch the coal at $30, but deem it to come from the hydro 2,000 megawatts that's base scheduled because you have no constraint that says that the hydro can only be deemed if it increases its production above the counterfactual. And this is what we're seeing widespread in the EIM.
So we don't have that constraint. What we do is we limit the attribution to hydro to 1,000 megawatts because this is the difference between the total available bid and the counterfactual, 3,000 minus 2,000.
But you let it, that's right, you're limiting it to the upward capability.
No.
But it allows the coal to get dispatched and get deemed to come from hydro when the hydro is not incrementally dispatched.
No, it's not a dynamic constraint. It says that you cannot attribute more than 1,000 megawatts of hydro, and similarly, you cannot attribute more than 1,000 megawatts of coal. Now, you're looking at what the import will cost to California, all right, and it's $40 for hydro and $60 for coal. Obviously, hydro is more economic, so it will clear, will get a greenhouse gas attribution before the coal, in this example.
It'll get a greenhouse gas attribution to the hydro, even if the hydro is not dispatched above the 2,000, because it has 2,000 megawatts of counterfactual output, total output. It has upward capability of 1,000 megawatts. It will assign it to the hydro, even if it doesn't dispatch the hydro, and the EIM data shows that occurring.
No, that's not what I said. Okay, Mark, stay with me. I said that it will get up to 1,000 megawatt of greenhouse gas attribution. I didn't say it won't be dispatched. Why you say it's not going to be dispatched? It's cheaper, right? So we're going to dispatch the hydro above the counterfactual, and we're going to give it an attribution for whatever is dispatched above the counterfactual. It can get up, so the hydro could dispatch up to 3,000 megawatts and can get up to 1,000 megawatts of attribution for serving 1,000 megawatts of load in California.
But George, if the hydro is not dispatched up because the coal fuel price is lower, so the coal's at $30 fuel price, the hydro's at 40, and let's say there's only 1,000 megawatts of import space.
No, I understand your example perfectly. But why are you assuming that you're going to dispatch coal because it's cheaper? Coal is only cheaper for serving outside load, and that is already met in the counterfactual. What we're looking
where
now
is your constraint that prevents the software from deeming the hydro when it's to its incremental production? You have no constraint in your software that says if the hydro runs at 2,000 megawatts and has 1,000 megawatts of headroom, and it gets dispatched zero, you're not preventing it from being deemed delivered to California. You're allowing it to get deemed delivered when it's running at its counterfactual output, because, and your slides show it, you're limiting it to exports from the BA, to the total output, which is 2,000,
okay,
and to the incremental capability. You're not limiting it to the incremental dispatch. Where is your constraint that limits hydro deeming to the incremental dispatch?
Okay, there's no such constraint, but in your example, there's a flow, potentially a flow, and I'll point it out, right? You say that the counterfactual is 2,000 megawatt of hydro dispatch and 2,000 megawatt of coal dispatch. all right?
Yes.
You said the coal for serving load outside is $30 and the hydro is $40. So obviously in the counterfactual, the coal should clear before the hydro. Unless you have some multiple bids for the coal and the $30 bid for the coal is only for the 2,000 and the other 1,000 has a higher price that doesn't clear the counterfactual. So
Let me give you the example again, George. Let me give you the example again.
Another.
The 2,000 megawatts of coal is at zero. It's min-gen. It's must-run. The 2,000 megawatts of hydro is at zero. It's must-run. The 1,000 megawatts of incremental production on the coal is offered at 30. The 1,000 megawatts of incremental hydro is offered at 40. The software in the EIM and what you're proposing here will dispatch incrementally the coal from 2,000 to 3,000 because it sees it can do that at $30, and then it sees that it can deem the hydro to be the 1,000 megawatt source and not dispatch it up because you have no constraint that requires that in order for a resource to be deemed, it has to have incremental production of that amount above the counterfactual.
Mark, I will go very slowly on this so that we can get through it because you're getting hung up on something, all right? So we clear the counterfactual. The counterfactual means that you have met the load outside. Okay?
Yes.
That was 4,000 megawatts of load and was met in your latest example by self-schedules from 2,000 from hydro and 2,000 from coal. And now you have additional bids with greenhouse gas, all right? You have 1,000 megawatt energy bid with zero greenhouse gas bid either from the hydro, and 1,000 megawatt of 30 energy plus 30, you said coal, a total of $60 for serving California load from coal. You're looking at the California solution, all right, and you have some expensive marginal resource that you want to displace it from imports. What's the cost of dispatching 1,000 megawatts of hydro, which is the available bed, to displace that generation in California? It's $40, you said. What's the cost from getting it from the coal? It's 30 plus 30, it's $60. Obviously, we select the hydro up to 1,000 megawatts.
George, that is not right. George, the software can say that I can dispatch the coal and deem it to come from hydro because the hydro is available to be deemed at $0 without being dispatched up. It's running at 2,000. It doesn't need to be dispatched up. It can deem it at 0, and then it can dispatch the coal up at 30 and dispatch the coal and deem it to come from hydro. And the EIM data shows this is happening widespread. We see coal and gas outside being exported from BAs, and it's being deemed to come from hydro that's not even exporting. The reason that's occurring is because it can dispatch the coal and deem it to come from hydro that is not incrementally dispatched, and your proposal here does not put in a constraint that a resource can only be deemed delivered for its incremental output. You're limiting it to its incremental capability, which enables the software to do the mix and match that we've described.
Okay, let me understand. You're saying that there actually is going to be a displacement of the hydro with the coal, all right? And we do have 1,000 megawatt of available capacity of the hydro, but you say this is not going to be dispatched because it doesn't need to be dispatched. All you need is to allocate or to give a greenhouse gas attribution to the top 1,000 out of the 2,000 megawatts that hydro was cleared.
That's right.
In the counterfactual, right? But you also said that this was a self-schedule for the hydro.
I'm saying that the 2,000 megawatts of hydro cleared in the counterfactual. It can be self-scheduled, it can be 0, it can be $10, but it cleared.
No, but it's important, Mark. You keep changing your example. If you make it
if you want to use it as a self-schedule, George, you can use it as a self-schedule if you like. My point is that 2,000 megawatts of hydro and 2,000 megawatts of coal cleared in the counterfactual to serve load outside. They both have 1,000 megawatts of incremental capability. The coal is cheaper than the hydro. The software will dispatch the coal and deem the 1,000 of the 2,000 megawatts of hydro that was running anyways to serve load outside.
Okay. So you're saying that there's going to be a greenhouse gas attribution of 1,000 megawatt to hydro, but it's going to be below the greenhouse gas reference. Is that what you're saying, Mark?
Can you say that again, George?
That the hydro is going to receive 1,000 megawatt greenhouse gas attribution below the greenhouse gas reference?
I don't know what you mean by below the greenhouse gas reference. It's got 1,000 megawatts of incremental offer. It's willing to be deemed delivered for 1,000 megawatts. It's got 2,000 megawatts of production, so it meets your one constraint that it's running at least 1,000. It's got 1,000 megawatts of upward capability. It meets your second constraint criteria, but it doesn't need to be dispatched in order for you to deem it delivered above the 2,000.
Okay. So if it doesn't need to be dispatched, because we allow it to get 1,000 megawatt greenhouse gas attribution, okay, it may get 1,000 megawatt of greenhouse gas attribution, even though it's not going to be incrementally dispatched, right? And then you say that the coal is going to backfill that attribution because you have now out of the 2,000 megawatts of self-scheduled hydro, all right, you allocate 1,000 megawatts of greenhouse gas attribution to the top 1,000 of that. So that now is serving California load, right? That's what you're saying. And then you have to backfill that for serving external load. And you say the backfilling is going to come from the coal, which is cheaper than the hydro for external load, right?
That's the way you look at it, George. But yes, the coal will run by 1,000 megawatts incrementally above its counterfactual. The source of the supply will be hydro. Now let's assume the internal gas generation that's backing down is $50. Look at what the software is going to do. It's going to incrementally dispatch coal at $30 with $30 of emissions to back down internal gas at 50. When what it should have done was take the $40 hydro and incrementally dispatch that to back down the internal gas. What we've done is increase emissions because there's no software constraint in your resource-specific proposal that says the hydro can only be deemed delivered by its incremental output above the counterfactual. You're allowing it to get deemed delivered on its counterfactual megawatts.
It's because this methodology does not account for secondary emission costs. When the coal is backfilling the hydro, the emission cost of that is not part of the objective function. We're not capturing all the secondary emission costs. This is
I don't see how you call that a secondary dispatch cost, George. You have a counterfactual where 4,000 megawatts is running to serve load. It's 2,000 megawatts of coal. It's 2,000 megawatts of hydro. You've increased the coal by 1,000. Right. Hydro has not increased its output. That's not backfill. That's coal getting a primary dispatch to serve California load to back down gas, but inaccurately deeming it to come from the hydro.
No, the primary dispatch for the coal is 2,000. It's the counterfactual. What happens is we're taking 1,000 megawatt of hydro that clear the counterfactual, and now we direct it to serve California load because we're giving it an attribution. Now you have to backfill it. You're backfilling it with coal in your example, and the cost, the atmospheric cost of that emission for the coal is not captured as a cost in the objective function. It's secondary dispatch cost, Mark.
Okay, George, let me ask you this. If we don't have imports to California, we would have ran the coal at 2,000 and the hydro at 2,000, right? We're not, those are the levels that would tend to serve load outside. That's the counterfactual.
Correct. That's your primary dispatch. Well,
that's right.
Primary dispatch. Yeah.
So we're not dispatching the coal to 3,000 to back down the hydro, because in the counterfactual, we would have ran the coal at 2,000 and the hydro at 2,000, and that was the right solution to serve load outside. We're only increasing the coal production because we're backing down gas inside California.
Right, but with the prices that you gave me, this is not the economic solution for outside, but you trump the economic solution by you say the 2,000 megawatt of its resource.
But George, what we're doing is we're taking the cap and, in my example, we're taking the cap and trade program and we're increasing coal production above what it would have ran to serve load outside displacing internal gas and increasing emissions. How are we meeting the objective of the program at all without limiting what gets deemed delivered to incremental production?
Mark, simple question. You set the prices 40 for the hydro and 30 for the coal for serving load outside. The coal is cheaper. In your counterfactual, unless you have constraints, the coal is going to be scheduled first and then the hydro. To have 2,000
George, let me describe. It's not, and I was very clear on this, that the first 2,000 of coal, the first 2,000 of hydro is not bid at $30 and $40. This is what's happening all over the EIM. A lot of resources have to run a certain amount of output at min-gen. They might be self-scheduled, they might be priced at zero, they might be priced at low prices because they need to run that amount. The incremental output is at $30 for the coal. The incremental output is at $40 for the hydro. If you look all over the West, there is hydro all over the West that has a certain amount it needs to run as price taker, and then it has incremental output that it needs to offer at a price to protect against depleting that water. That's the example I gave you, and that's what we see regularly in the real world.
Mark, my answer to you about secondary dispatch stands, and we agree to disagree. I don't think we can proceed with this argument on this call. We should take it offline.
I appreciate that. I guess just the last thing I'd say, George, is can you consider, please, and explain why you will not apply a constraint that limits resources deeming quantity to their incremental production above the counterfactual? And if you can do that in writing, or I don't want to take up any more time.
Yeah,
I have done this before, and it's really simple, and I can tell you right now again. I have explained that before. If we put a dynamic constraint in the model that says we only attribute incremental dispatch above the counterfactual, okay? This gives the model, the optimization, an economic incentive to dispatch resources outside the greenhouse gas regulation areas uneconomically higher than their greenhouse gas reference for the purpose of giving them a greenhouse gas attribution. In other words, it weighs in the uneconomic dispatch outside with getting a cheaper import energy to displace resources in, let's say, California. The result of that is that you have an uneconomic solution for serving load outside of California for the benefit of California load. We explained that in the past, and this is the reason why we don't believe that this is a correct solution from a market operator perspective. We cannot favor California load versus external load.
I hear you, George. I know we need to move on, so I'm going to leave it at that. We're going to have to agree to disagree. I think that what we want to attribute the GHG or resource-specific source to is the resources that actually increase their production above what they would have ran to serve their load of that entity. And I think it's problematic that you're not proposing that.
It's problematic if we propose it, Mark.
All right. I think it warrants kind of further discussion offline, but appreciate the comments, Mark. And we'd love to kind of see more of those examples in writing from you and kind of be able to speak to them in the draft final proposal or in an offline conversation. I'd also point to George's Excel tool that kind of looks at the assumptions and kind of documents this example. Marvin, could we move on to the next caller?
Anya, thank you, Stuart Kelly. And I think George pretty much answered my question. The reason for my question was the discussion in Folsom and the importance of the reference point when it comes to price formation. But bottom line, George, the GHG reference point is only getting used for attribution purposes if I followed the last discussion. Is that correct? It's not getting used in the optimization.
I'm sorry, Stuart. I don't think
the GHG reference point is only for attribution purposes. It's not.
It's only used as a reference to limit how much greenhouse gas attribution you can give to a resource. So if a 100 megawatt resource hits all of its 100 megawatt of capacity and gets an attribution, and gets a greenhouse gas reference at 60 megawatts, all right, we can only attribute 40 megawatt resource depending on its dispatch, right? So we use the greenhouse gas reference as a mechanism to limit the attribution. That doesn't mean that the attribution is going to be necessarily given to an incremental dispatch, because we don't have that constraint, the dynamic constraint that we were arguing with Mark. So potentially that attribution could also be given to capacity below the greenhouse gas reference. And
understood. It's not implemented as a dynamic constraint, only to consider what's available for dispatch above the reference point for the reasons you outlined. Okay, perfect. Thank you, George.
All right, could we unmute Qatar's line?
Tar, please go ahead.
Hello?
We can hear you.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, I believe.
Qatar, are you able to hear us?
George, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, since you had
I can hear you.
Since you had a really good discussion at home, and I'm going to go easier now. So I'm looking into straw proposal, and I'm back on that gaming concern. And there is explanation in straw proposal that gaming should not be concerned because in EDAM, because when it was raised in EIM, it was related to something that is not really clear to me. Something to do with base schedules. And actually that concern had nothing to do with base schedules. Because in EIM, you have base schedules, but you have either ink bits above base schedule or DAC bits below base schedule or both. An optimal reference or base GHG calculation in EIM for dispatching those ink and DAC bits and base schedules play no role in that optimization. In that sense, it is the same in EDAM because you have full range bid from minimum DAC to maximum ink. In other words, the concern that was raised in EIM is still valid in EDAM. And concern was always that people can do similar to what Holman did, where you, and it's shown by example, when you increase the bid a little bit of some units, that you want dispatch them in reference point. But then in optimization, you dispatch to full extent for import. And that way you maximize your GHG payment. So did you review that paragraph in your proposal, and do you agree that we don't have the same concern in EDAM because it's different than calculation reference point in EIM? You there?
Peter, I'm trying to understand this is George Angelidis. I'm trying to understand your point here. Are you comparing the proposal for EDAM with what is the current status quo in EIM regarding the counterfactual? In EIM, we're basically...
No. I'm saying that the counterfactual calculation in EIM and EDAM is exactly the same. It is optimization of...
It's not. No.
What is the difference?
It's not. The difference
what is the difference?
And it's a huge difference. So in EIM, we use the base schedule submitted by participants as the greenhouse gas counterfactual. These schedules are not...
No. Wait, George. I'm not talking about what you implement in EIM. I'm talking about proposal from 2017 that we gave up on it, which had two-pass solution. In that proposal, optimal reference point calculation was exactly the same as it is proposed right now. That's what I'm talking about. I know that in EIM we didn't implement that. I'm not talking about it.
Right,
I'm just saying,
we did not.
When we had that proposal, and it clearly described that sole proposal for enhancement, it was exactly the same calculation of reference point like it is proposed in EDAM, and concern was raised about gaming in calculating reference point and you having two-pass solution. And there's a specific example that shows that you can game the system by increasing a little bit your bits in goal to reduce your dispatch in first pass and then maximize your revenue because your GAG attribution will be maximized. And I read this before, and I think it's still concerned, and I hope people who discussed this in the past are on this call and can chime in on this. Because if you remember, we had a long discussion with Paul about this, and I believe this is still a concern. And I disagree with what is written in stroke report. The whole section on page 78, that first paragraph is not correct.
So just to understand your point, I remember the earlier proposal that we didn't implement in EIM, which was the two-pass solution, and the first pass you're calculating a counterfactual, which is akin to what is proposed here in EDAM, where we're having a pass for calculating a greenhouse gas counterfactual. And you're saying there are potential gaming issues with this two-stage two-pass approach.
Before we agree about that, George, we need to agree or disagree that two-pass solution that we were thinking about in EIM and two-pass solution that is proposed in EDAM are practically the same.
Yeah, I did say the proposal in EDAM is akin to what we earlier considered for EIM.
Okay.
But what's the point? Are you making an argument that maybe we shouldn't have a counterfactual?
If they're the same, then CAISO should say, okay, we had concern about this, but we don't believe that concern is serious because that concern is still there. And we believe that we can move forward with this approach because that concern is not valid or is not a big deal, it's not very unlikely. What is written right now is like what was proposed in EIM was different, and that concern was valid for EIM, but it's not valid for EDAM because it's different. No, they're the same. So CAISO needs to take position, is that concern still valid or not for EDAM? Okay, that's one point. The other point is the whole discussion about gaming is that people are trying to game the system in that scenario to maximize their GAG attribution. Now, if you don't allocate to resources, if you do this zonal, what LA is proposing, then people don't have incentive to game it. They have only risk not to be scheduled if they increase their bids. So if CAISO thinks that this concern is valid, potential solution for that is not to attribute to resources, to attribute to imports like in LA proposal. And that will address also the issue that Holman is raising without introducing that additional constraint. In addition to that, people who are participating in EIM, because there is no attribution to resources, there is no administrative overhead to deal with CARB and Washington and Oregon, whoever has additional program, people will not have incentive anymore to opt out from bidding into GG zones because there is not that large administrative overhead. So that's another big advantage of going zonal. And my last point is about that constraint you were discussing with Holman. When I talk about that, you said the main concern is introduction of binary variables. And that was really big value concern in EIM because in RTD in 5 minutes, it was very difficult to solve twice RTD. But this is less of concern in EDAM because you have way more time to solve it. And in addition to that, when you said new arguments against that it can impact optimality of the solution efficiency in the market, it will if you put that constraint on total power, but if you put it just on allocation, it's not going to impact efficiency in the market. If you put that on that E variable that you have in formulation, then it will not make optimal solution less economic. That's all I had.
Peter, on that last one, can you send me
I'll send you
an email because I need to see what you're saying there. And by the way, this is nothing no argument.
That allocation variable for export per unit is less than max of 0 and difference between total power and reference. I'll send you that constraint, George.
Yeah, that's
I think Homer has a good point. You can always, sometimes I agree with Homer, you can always construct the case, and you have did before, that you are not awarding wrong allocation. You're just making sure that allocation is not bigger than difference between dispatch and maximum bid and reference point. So the only way to make sure that it's not allocated, if it's not about GHG reference, you have to have this additional constraint.
All right, so you're not suggesting anything different. You're still suggesting the same constraint, which is I already responded. Besides the binary variables, I have a problem with the price formation with that constraint. I explained, and I still stand by it. If you prove me wrong, send me something to see what you're suggesting.
No, I'm not recommending that. I think you should go zonal accounting on imports. And it's not big.
Okay.
I know you guys complain that it's big for car to change regulation. That's actually not. And it's going to make life easier for everybody, including car. So
let me ask you this. Let me ask you this question, because I think I know where you're going. You're saying the ability that participants have in the proposal to submit a greenhouse gas bid may create a situation of gaming with this two-pass setup, all right?
Yeah.
And in the LA proposal, there's no ability to...
George.
Yes. Yeah.
George, I'm not saying that. Hogan said that.
What?
Bill Hogan said that in that paper. You have that paper.
Yeah, but okay, but there is a remediation on this. You know that we're capping the greenhouse gas bids so that they're not exorbitant, right? And we can even follow the LA approach.
George, you're not capping GHG bids. That gaming is pushing a reference point down, and your cap is not working because the lower reference point doesn't matter that you are capping to GHG bid minus reference point. The game is to minimize reference points.
Yes, but if you bid low, if you bid below your costs to minimize your greenhouse gas reference, that's going to hurt you better because we're using the same bid that we use to calculate the reference. We use the same bid in the market.
That's a fair point. That's why Kaiser needs to say, look, people who are playing this game, they are intentionally increasing their bid to minimize the reference point, but then they're running risk not to reschedule. And actually, that's not a big deal.
We will state that. We will state that in the proposal.
Yeah. But I hope that Anna is on the call and the DNM is in the call. The holes that people were coming through in the past to game it was way smaller than this hole. Okay? Way smaller. So I would be really surprised if people don't abuse this because it's so trivial to do it. But in any case, I'm not arguing for additional constraint, that kind of band-aid. I still believe that if you move to intertie accounting, to zonal accounting, and avoid this whole business allocation, you fix so many problems. And even that residual leaking or whatever CARB is calculating, even that calculation can be simplified. So it will fix many problems if you really go in the direction of not allocating the resources to allocate to imports. Anyway, I'm beginning to sound like my opponent, so I'm going to stop here.
All right, thank you, Petar. Can we move to the next caller, Marvin?
Yeah, and just before we take Kathleen's question, I just want to remind everyone to please state your name and organization before asking your question.
Great. I'll start and see if you can hear me. This is Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. Can you hear me?
Yes. Hi, Kathleen.
Hi. I want to thank everyone for the robust discussion so far on this. I think it's helpful to highlight. I mean, what it highlights for me is that there are some pretty high-level policy goals and design goals that I hear the stakeholder communities, at least those who have spoken, share that this design should meet. I understand the CAISO, it appears the CAISO doesn't share those goals the same way. And so I kind of wanted to highlight that. I know last week we were trying to delve into, well, why, and trying to figure out why there's this distance. But on today's call, I want to support what Mark Coleman said. I disagree with the position that this is a secondary dispatch cost. The way that I view it is it's a miscalculation of incremental megawatts that could support a net import into the greenhouse gas area. And it's intentional. It appears to be intentionally miscalculating that, inconsistent with the environmental program. So one question I have for the CAISO to take back, for sake of time, is take back and the question I have for you is, why do you believe that not accurately accounting for what is the incremental IFM award above the reference point, which is the limit that resource could possibly ever be supporting a transfer? It still may not be it still may not be supporting that net import, but it cannot be more than that. And why you don't believe that's more consistent with the environmental program? I think that would help me understand that the distance that I'm seeing between our view and yours. Does that question make sense, Anya?
Yeah, Kathleen, I think it's going to help for us to kind of spend some more time on GHG here in the future. I think George has spoken to this, and I'll defer to him here just in terms of his modeling efforts, kind of looking at that constraint and the price formation, kind of negative price formation impacts that constraint can introduce. George, I know you've kind of touched on this already on the call, but do you want to elaborate on that at all?
And for sake of time, I'd actually ask that we not, because I think George has elaborated extensively on that, and I have the notes from your earlier answer, George. Yeah, and I appreciate that, and I will take that back.
I'm not going to repeat.
So I appreciate it. I did take the notes down when you were answering and explaining, so we'll think about that more. I commit to that. I do want to try to bridge this gap. When I have looked at the solver models, I think I know what you're talking about, but I have not had the same reaction, and I haven't arrived at the same belief that it is a suboptimal solution. But I am an economist, and I view negative externalities as a real thing. And so when I'm looking at environmental externalities and how they're being priced in to the outcome, I actually expect the cost to go up. in certain areas because the negative externality is more appropriately being accounted for. So I am concerned that the conclusion is actually being, could be interpreted differently if we can share the same, can talk through the policy position of that negative externality. And so I think it would be helpful to have you show the specific solution that your concern is uneconomic and give us the opportunity to provide you all the feedback of, I don't see that as uneconomic and here's why, to help us bridge that gap. And we can, I think talking offline would be helpful, but we should also bring it back to the stakeholder group. But I wanted to pointedly say, I don't at this point share your same concerns. And I think it's because we view externalities from a different perspective because I'm an economist and I factor that into how I view the market design. The other thing I wanted just to note is that I thought Stuart's question was a really good question, but I didn't hear a precise answer to it. I heard Stuart ask if the reference point is included in the optimization, and I wanted to very clearly say yes. It is absolutely included in the optimization. What it is driving is if you have an inaccurate approach, the number of megawatts that can meet the net transfer constraint are greater than if you have a more accurate calculation. That will be a smaller amount of megawatts that can meet the requirement on that net transfer constraint. So what is happening in practice, which I brought up on earlier calls, is that the shadow price of the greenhouse gas shadow price today is being suppressed because there are too many megawatts that cannot actually support a net import transfer into the greenhouse gas area because of the misattribution. So when we say misattribution, what we mathematically mean is your bucket of megawatts that can go to meet this requirement on a merit order basis is too large, and you're including in the meeting the constraint a portion of the stack that is lower than it should be, where you're suppressing prices, and that directly impacts dispatches in a way that disadvantages resources that truly are either internal or external, that have a higher emission rate, that are being incrementally dispatched relative to their reference on the outside, or specifically internal generators that are more efficient. When you suppress the greenhouse gas shadow price, you could view the solution as more economic to rely on the transfer instead of the internal generator, but that is false because your pricing is false. So I just wanted to be clear, because I didn't hear you say yes to that answer. And when someone asks, is this impacting optimization, which impacts dispatches and price formation, that the answer really should be a clear yes. And that's all I have. Thank you.
Yeah, maybe just a follow-up to that, Kathleen. Would you just be able to send us an example of what you're referring to when you're speaking that we're suppressing the GHG shadow price here?
I will certainly take a look at it. It's 9 months into this effort, and I will be transparent that I am disappointed that the CAISO has not understood the concerns that have been raised since the beginning of January, but I will endeavor to try to communicate them better.
Okay, examples help, so thank you for considering that.
Okay, I think we have one more person in the phone queue.
Hi, Anya. It's Callie Wells with WPTF. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, can hear you clearly. Thanks, Callie.
Wonderful, thanks. So I don't want to belabor the conversation. I think we've had a very robust discussion so far on the constraint to limit attribution to the incremental dispatch. So I'll just say that I share Mark and Kathleen's perspectives on that. And I did hear you mention that you'll have continued conversations about this and the price formation concern that George has talked about with introducing that constraint in the market. So I guess my ask is, if you have those conversations, and I think we should, that they be done in a public forum. WPTF at the beginning of this effort back in January, February, actually did the solver that looked at that constraint. We presented our examples. We looked at the price formation concern that the CAISO brought up back in EIM, and we didn't share the same perspective. We didn't think that there was necessarily a price formation issue. In the last draw proposal, I think in a footnote, it notes that the CAISO has done some studies that looked at this. So I would ask that in that public conversation that maybe the CAISO can also bring forward their examples, because we've seen ours, we've talked through them, we don't see that issue. So if the CAISO can bring forward their examples that they've done that's alluded to in the revised draw proposal, I think that would be also extremely helpful to actually see what it is that's the concern, because I think it, like Kathleen mentioned, it might just be a different perspective in terms of what the right price formation is in a market design. So I'll just leave it at that. So I think that discussion would be extremely helpful, and especially to make sure that it's public and not kind of one-off conversations. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Kelly. And I think, last time we discussed this and some of the background here was that anytime kind of with that constraint in place, anytime there's economic displacement, you'd have awards that are less than the bids, and that was a concern. But we can look at finding an example to kind of show that effect and bring that back to the group. So thank you. All right, I see another hand up.
Hi, this is Nick Berkey from City of Anaheim Public Utilities. I know I talked to you briefly after the last meeting, Anya, regarding a comment that I heard George make during the last meeting, that when doing the second the counterfactual GHG path, that GHG bids would be removed as well as any virtual bids as well. And in reading over the revised straw proposal, I couldn't find any reference to that, to the fact that virtual bids would be removed. And I know we had a brief discussion regarding that this would seem to would affect the results of the counterfactual path. And I was just curious if you can confirm whether the virtual bids would be removed in the second path.
Yeah, so the virtuals are in the IFM, and I'll let George kind of speak to kind of the elaboration of why they're not in the reference path, but they are in the IFM.
Yes, so of course virtual bids are part of the IFM solution. They're in the market, and the greenhouse gas attribution is only given to physical resources, but you still have virtual bids clearing the IFM. So even if you have virtual bids outside California, they will still be scheduled to optimally meet demand outside of California. However, they will not receive greenhouse gas attribution to serve demand in California. I hope that answers your question.
Partially. I'm just concerned that if you don't do each pass equally by just removing GHG bids, because trying to phrase this correctly, but the virtual bids do have an impact on the supply stack that is affected, which is, I guess, the whole purpose of RUC and after the fact. And why wouldn't you just run both the same so that the only thing that has changed is the GHG bid? I mean, on page 77 of the revised draw proposal, it literally says, regarding the counterfactual run, this market run will be identical to the IFM, but without GHG bids. So I'm just curious why.
That's correct. So that's correct, without the GHG bids, but any virtual bids are still considered. So the term identical, it was meant with all its meaning. It's the same solution the same model that you have in the market round. The only thing that you do not consider any greenhouse gas bids, which means that you won't have attributions and you won't have greenhouse gas transfer imports into greenhouse gas regulation areas, but the rest of the solution is optimal for meeting demand outside of greenhouse gas regulation areas, and that's what's going to give you your counterfactual for the market pass that you're going to have now greenhouse gas bids and attributions. Is that clear?
I'll noodle over it, but I won't take up any more of your time. Thank you very much for your response.
Okay, there is a question in the chat, and it goes back to, I think, CARB's introductory remarks. So the question is that CARB process usually a few years at least?
I can't speak to that, but I don't know if we have someone from CARB that wants to kind of talk about the duration of time that rulemaking might take.
Hi, Anya. Can you hear me? This is Rachel Gold at CARB.
Yes, go ahead, Rachel.
CARB formal rulemaking process. Once the formal rulemaking process is initiated, it must be completed within a year. But typically there are informal workshops and prior to the formal start of a rulemaking. And so that means it could be more than a year's time. I hope that helps.
Yeah, thanks, Rachel.
Thanks, Rachel. And I see we've got another hand up from Kathleen.
Hi, thanks, Anya. And this will be super brief. This is Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. I just wanted to remind the CAISO and that I'm happy to have conversations offline that Vistra does not support the reference pass design generally, now that we're talking about it before you move off. And I raised the reasons why last week, so I won't belabor them. But to answer the individual who asked about virtuals cannot be included in this reference pass because we need accurate reference points. And if virtuals displace physical supply, we will not have an accurate reference point for what could actually be incremental above that resource. So that's just a very simple example for why you cannot include virtuals. You also need forecasts because you need to see what resources would be dispatched to meet the load, the expected load, at least at that point in time. And you need to block transfers so we can identify what that surplus looks like within a BAA at a resource NDA level. Again, I'll extend the offer to talk more offline, but just wanted to make sure that that was crystal clear and happy to take any questions.
Yeah, I think there's maybe kind of a philosophy of still kind of looking to see kind of have the benefits of economic displacement outside of the greenhouse gas regulation area when looking at that counterfactual. So maybe it's kind of a philosophy difference there, and would love to hear kind of your thoughts on why you might not want to see that economic displacement.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that question, Anya. I think it's a good one. Our philosophy is that the purpose of the greenhouse gas market design features should be an administration of the environmental rules, not creating novel new design concepts from a wholesale market perspective. So the environmental program doesn't value the economic displacement that you're talking about. The environmental program values as accurately as possible, determining source specified versus unspecified imports into that greenhouse gas regulation area. And so the primary and truly only design goals are administering the environmental program rules as they are developed and approved by the regulators, CARB and the Department of Ecology. I don't philosophically believe that the CAISO should be expanding the greenhouse gas design to try to incorporate a principle of the CAISO. It's not appropriate in our view.
And this was maybe going back to the principle of not disadvantaging areas that do not have a greenhouse gas pricing program in place by looking at what is optimal dispatch in their area, not including greenhouse gas costs. So,
yeah, and our design, so like our interests respect those design principles. And I have very much so had in mind that clean energy standard areas need to be treated fairly. This reference point needs to be a reasonable result for them, which is why we need to respect all of these designs. You don't have to price, there's not a cap and trade program where you need to put in the pricing, but the concept of you need to respect the fact that they are going to be on their own, representing that a certain portion of resources are serving the percentage of load that they need to serve is what they're fulfilling. And if you begin to strip away the ability for them to show that by not taking on the design principles that we've been asking you to, you're going to make it much more difficult for the areas under a clean energy standard to support, here are the resources that would support our load. Anything above that is excess. These goals are consistent across the entire area, and we have been thinking about the design holistically so that it does not disadvantage any participant. We just ask the CAISO to share the same concerns.
all right, thanks for your comment, Kathleen. Are there any other hands up, Marvin?
No other hands up at this time.
All right, let's go ahead and move to the next slide. So I realize we've had a discussion on some of the constraints that participants are looking for. I do want to talk about some of the constraints that we've included in the revised job proposal to help limit and reduce secondary dispatch, noting that we're not able to eliminate secondary dispatch entirely. And noting that some of these measures that we've put in place to limit attribution also mean that it can limit transfers. So I'll frame the first category of constraints as scheduling constraints, limiting the resource-specific attributions to the max of their bid, the max of the optimal dispatch, and the difference between the resource's upper economic limit and GHG reference path. This is akin to the steps that we took in the WEIM to limit attribution to the greenhouse gas bid capacity, the optimal dispatch, and in that case, the max of the difference between the upper economic limit and the base schedule. We're also introducing and have discussed hourly net transfer constraint, and this is really designed to better align attribution with physical flows and not allow GHG attribution in cases either above BA export limits or if the BAA is a net importer. So let's go to the next slide. And in this example, we're looking at BAA, and in our ending 16, they're a net exporter to BAAB and BAAC, and export kind of limits are 40 megawatts to BAAB in our ending 16 and 60 megawatts to BAAC, or total exports, meaning that total attribution can't exceed the sum of those exports, which is 100 megawatts. And let's move to the next example. Here we have BAA as a net importer from BAAB and BAAC in our ending 16, meaning that the attribution will be 0. All right, and let's move on to the last slide. Just wanted to spend a moment touching on the data that we can make available to support states and market participants. And for states, I'll flag that today CAISO reports in the WEAM, total WEAM entity level megawatt hour greenhouse gas attributions to CARB. And it's through OATI that CARB collects total megawatt hours of tagged imports outside of the WEAM, which is used to QA imports reported to CARB under their mandatory reporting rule. And we are willing to provide total WEAM and EDAM transfers to states with GHG pricing programs, and also if there are not GHG pricing programs in place. For market participant reported data, currently WEI market participants receive settlement statements that include their GHG attributions, and that information is also provided through CMRI. In EDAM, we are planning on providing settlement statements that include greenhouse gas attributions in day ahead and real time. And real time would be that deviation from day ahead. I see Todd Ryan has a hand up. Go ahead, Todd.
Good morning, Todd Ryan with Pacific Gas and Electric. Hey, Anya, I have a question about these BAA level constraints, and I'm curious, are they should they be with respect to the reference paths? I'm just thinking like in your net importer constraint, for example, if a BA in its reference path is net exporting or net importing, I don't know, a gigawatt, but then in the actual dispatch, it's only net importing 100 megawatts. Would that still be counted as secondary dispatch, or ought it to be counted as secondary dispatch and available for allocation?
Could you repeat that example just briefly, Todd?
So a BA net importing a gigawatt in the reference path, but in real time or in the disk schedule, either day ahead schedule or it's importing only 100 megawatts. So the difference is that maybe some economic displacements happen, and now it's effectively from a secondary dispatch level, one could argue might be effectively exporting 900 megawatts that it wouldn't have exported, or importing 900 megawatts less. Maybe it's not a perfect example, and maybe I may have not thought it fully through, but I'm just wondering if these constraints should be with respect to the reference level.
And our attempt here was to model it so that it reflects dispatch. So if actual exports were 100 megawatts out, not looking at that import example, it would be limited to 100 megawatts. I'd like to hear kind of maybe some further clarity on why you recommend it be limited based on the GHG reference paths, and that may be helpful.
Maybe the exporting example might be better. If someone's exporting a gigawatt, but in the reference path was supposed to import a gigawatt, one might be able to say that there's actually more of a secondary dispatch change, almost 2 gigawatts. But again, it's just something to think about. Maybe if others who understand GHG better than I in the group would help me understand why we wouldn't need to make these constraints relative to the reference path.
This is George Angelidis. So I think we had the same discussion much earlier with Mark Holman. So what I explained to Mark there was that this net export constraint that I believe you're talking about, Tom, for BAAs that are outside the greenhouse gas regulation area, we limit the total greenhouse gas attribution in the market pass to what is scheduled as a net export from that BAA in the same market pass. So that's a dynamic constraint. The reference position, we only use it to limit attributions at the resource level, and we don't do it dynamically based on the dynamic constraints we were discussing earlier. So we're not going to use the greenhouse gas reference as a point to anchor that net export constraint for these BAAs. The rationale here of using the export that clears in the market is that since we know that this BAA is exporting, let's say, 100 megawatts, we don't want to attribute more than 100 megawatts of greenhouse gas bits in the area, because if it's really exporting 100 megawatts, it cannot really serve more than 100 megawatts of load in a greenhouse gas regulation area, unless you consider it an accounting problem and you allow secondary dispatch and backfilling, and this is what we're trying to limit. So that's why we anchor that constraint dynamically on what net export clears in the same market pass. Is that clearing up the confusion?
Not entirely, but I will think on it some more, and maybe we can follow up offline. Thank you for your help.
Marvin, could we go ahead and unmute Mark Holman's line?
Hi, thanks. Mark Holman with Powers. Can we just back up a few slides, because it just highlights the issue, I think, that we just needs to be clarified in the written material that CAISO puts out. If we can back up to where you first described the export constraint. So please don't take this as a criticism. I just want to make sure that what gets documented is not conflicting in multiple locations and or unclear. Number 2 describes the hourly net export constraint as limited to the BAA transfer limits, and that suggests to me that if a BA had a 1 megawatt incremental dispatch in its BA that led to 1 megawatt of exports in the IFM, but it had 1,000 megawatt export limit, you could attribute up to 1,000 megawatts. And what George is saying is no, if it exports 1 megawatt in that interval in the IFM, we would only assign 1 megawatt to it. And so these seem to be, number 2 seems to be inconsistent with what George is describing, which is a dynamic limit based on actual exports versus a more static limit based on the transfer limit, not the actual transfers. So can we just clarify that it's actual transfers, not transfer limit, as on this slide?
Yeah, that is correct, Mark, and that's my error. So thanks for flagging. We can update the materials with that red line.
I really appreciate that, and no problem at all. I know we're moving at a lightning speed, so that's an easy mistake to make. I just wanted to make sure we're clear in the written documents going forward. I think the second one I just wanted to raise related to that is just to really maybe ask George, is that what's being proposed here then is a dynamic limit based on actual exports. To me, that is, unless George can describe otherwise, that is no more technically challenging than applying a dynamic limit based on incremental production of resources above the counterfactual. So we're not in a technical challenge anymore. We're into a policy debate about whether we should apply a constraint that says the resources that actually increase their production above what they would have ran at to serve native load are the ones eligible to be deemed to be the source or not. And it's really a policy debate, including the impacts to price and dispatch, but it's not a technical challenge given that you're proposing a dynamic constraint here that is very similar from a technical implementation perspective.
Mark, I would like to answer. This is George Angelidis. So let me give you 2 answers here. The first one, this is indeed a dynamic constraint, and it will require a binary variable to linearize it, but this is for the net attribution of the BAA. It's not resource specific, so it's one binary variable per BAA per hour, and it's only the BAAs that are outside the greenhouse gas regulation area. So that is a different scale of having a binary variable for each resource that has a greenhouse gas bit. So it's a magnitude of difference. But on the second answer, we always try to make any debate at the policy level. Yes, we have some constraints that are technological, and we're trying to resolve policy, being mindful of potential technological constraints, but we don't want technology to put really a limit on what should be the right policy. We're driving very hard to remove or resolve technically all limitations. Now, at some point, yes, we have to be cognizant that what we're proposing and what we're set policy for, it has to be really implementable, and we run in trouble sometime, but we don't want this to be really something that will preclude us from doing the right thing. Then, on the back end, we'll figure out how to implement it and how to do it. And we may need to cut corners, but this is something that we do at a later stage. We just need to be cognizant of what we're asking to implement. On the issue that we're debating earlier, yeah, I would like to resolve this with what is the right thing to do, rather than, we don't have to be constrained by the fact that we have a performance hit for having all these binary variables. This is a concern, but I think the primary concern is to decide what is best to do. So the price formation issue is, in my book, the number one issue that we need to resolve and find out what is best to do. Thank you.
George, I really appreciate that answer, and I really appreciate the clarity, because my understanding on the limiting it to incremental production and having a dynamic constraint, the dialogue on that over the last several years has been that it was a technical challenge. I'm really glad to see that you can now do a dynamic constraint, and if you want to implement that with binary variables, that's great. If there's other ways to implement it, that's great. Now we can get to the policy around how do we accurately attribute, what is the implication to prices, whether we do it the way the CAISO is proposing to not limit it to incremental production, or the way it sounds like several stakeholders are proposing, which is it should be limited, the attribution, to incremental production above what would have ran elsewhere. That lets us center in on the policy debate. We agree there are price formation issues, but we see it on the opposite side. It's important to increase the price to reflect the societal costs of GHG emissions associated with resources increasing their production to be imported into a state with a GHG pricing program. So we actually see price formation issues with what you're proposing, which is it lowers the price through inaccurate attribution. Thanks, George.
All right, and Morgan, could we unmute Don Tretheway's line?
Hi, it's Don Tretheway from GDS Associates. I would highly recommend that everyone read Bill Hogan's paper from 2017 when we were looking at two-pass solutions previously. He makes very compelling arguments that any material first-pass solution introduces actually pricing issues, not pricing solutions.
Thanks, Don. I think we've got that footnoted in the paper for folks' reference, so thanks for flagging that. Marvin, could we unmute Stuart Kelly's line?
I think there's two sides to the argument. If you use the dynamic, reference level in optimization, some folks may think that's a better solution, but just as Don Tretheway said, and it's clearly spelled out in Hogan's paper, there's other issues that come with, or disadvantages to GHG zones that come with using it, the dynamic GHG reference in the optimization. And I'll just leave it there. Thanks.
Okay, thanks. And I just included that link in the chat for folks as well.
I think we have one more hand raised. Go to Petter.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello? Well, there is no ideal solution. Every solution has some pros and cons. And really, key is to find out which solution has the least amount of problems. By introducing this constraint that allocation can be only above reference point, it's going to improve allocation, but it's not going to make it completely accurate. In the same paper that Don was talking about, I was talking about, it was clearly shown that transmission constraints can result in some weird scenarios where unit that is not moving a second pass is allocated GG because of transmission limit. So the bottom line is there is no ideal solution, and it's all incremental enhancement, like adding this export constraint that allocation in BA cannot happen if BA is not exporting. But we have to understand that there is no ideal solution without problems, and it's just goal to figure out which one is the least problematic. Comparing zonal, resource-specific, LA proposal, or whatever, something else people can think about. Thank you.
Thank you. Those are some good observations to end on. With that, I'll turn things over to James Lynn.
Good morning, everybody. And it was a very enjoyable conversation. And I'm expecting we'll probably have some similar conversations during the transfer revenue discussion. But one of the things that I did hear over the last few meetings and through some email chat is that we need to level set a little bit on how we got from WEAM and the treatment of congestion revenue to where we're proposing with EDAM's treatment of congestion revenue. And this is particularly related to intertie transmission constraint congestion, as well as transfer scheduling limit congestion. In EDAM, we're referring to it all as congestion revenue for internal congestion, as well as the ITC congestion. That's all considered internal congestion or congestion revenue. And then we've made a very clear distinction as to what is transfer revenue. Now, previously, this could have been considered transfer congestion revenue, but we kind of dropped the word congestion to try and reduce the confusion, but I think it's actually added to it. So what I'm going to do here is probably for the next 10 slides is I am going to walk a little bit through some terminology that we're trying to address, as well as how we got from the introduction of WEAM to this proposal today. And we're going to cover certain areas like what is it, transfer, a little bit of discussion on asymmetrical wheeling issue that we identified, and how that added to the need to make the distinction between the transfer congestion revenue and then internal congestion revenue. So, but I want to start out with, and if we can, I'd like to be able to get through all this history and then take a few questions before I get into what the actual proposal is. So it's going to be about 10 slides. I will try to be brief but accurate and concise in my covering of them, and we'll take questions at the end of the history. So first thing I want to talk about is terminology. As I was trying to get into is one of the areas that we're looking at is congestion associated with the boundaries of BAA. We've all understand that internal transmission constraints, if transmission within the BAA itself between the generator and load, all this congestion is considered to be staying within that BAA because this is congestion or revenue or congestion that occurs to resolve generation's ability to meet load or demand forecast. But what the transfer revenue discussion has evolved around is one is intertie transmission constraints. And what an intertie transmission constraint is, it's an aggregated limit on schedules. And this includes non-EDAM, and I included here non-WEIM import and export schedules at the boundary of a BA, as well as transfer schedules. This is an aggregated limit on these schedules that clear the market at one or more scheduling points and or one or more transfer points. So what we do is, or you can do, is you can set up an ITC that incorporates scheduling point and transfer points, just scheduling points or just transfer points. And what this constraint does is it limits the flow or the schedule of energy into that BA or out of that BA based upon internal scheduling limits or transmission limits. As for the transfer scheduling limit, this is the aggregate limit of transfer scheduling. I'm not sure why the equal sign here, but it's co-optimized for energy and capacity, and it's determined primarily based upon the available transmission capacity that has been submitted to the ISO, the market operator, and it includes any updates due to planned or forced outages or derates. So this tells us this is the amount of actual transmission capacity that is being offered into the market in order to allow transfers between two BAAs. You can have a higher limit, but actually the available transmission limit sets the transfer scheduling limit. For EDAM, as I try to get into, transfer revenue previously could have been considered transfer congestion revenue, but we are going to consider this as the price difference between the marginal energy component of the LMP when BAAs have a binding constraint as the transfer scheduling limit and the energy price separates. And that transfer scheduling limit reaches for the EDAM BA at interfaces with other EDAM BAs. Congestion revenue, on the other hand, is a combination of two things. It is the price difference between the marginal congestion component of the LMP. This can include internal congestion, or it can be congestion associated with the ITC when the ITC is binding. It can be triggered, as I said, when internal congestion materializes as well as the ITC is final. I can go on to the next slide. Okay, so why do we have transfer schedule resources? In WEIM, when we looked at doing introducing the energy imbalance market, there was two things that had to be taken into consideration. One is the market is going to solve for the WEIM area, and it's going to look to have a least cost solution to have generation meet all of the WEIM area demand load. But in order to do that, it also had to take into consideration the transmission limits between BAAs as well as internal to the BAAs. However, what also we decided to do is that from a settlement perspective, we had to settle each BAA as individual BAAs, and isolate them and make sure that their energy settlement is neutral. So what this did is it drove the need to establish these WEIM energy transfer system resources. Now, in WEIM, there is transfer of energy between two BAs within the WEIM area using the transmission capacity made available, ATC, by the entity. They're aggregated resources at the DGAP, or default generation aggregation point. That's where they're being priced at, and it's that as well as the scheduling point and intertie. So it's the DGAP is considered the scheduling point and the intertie or the transfer point may have additional congestion that may have to apply. It represents the DGAP represents the aggregation of all supply resources within the BAA. And what we do is we dedicate a system resource in master file as either import or export to an associated WEAM ISO intertie. Now, it will also have an association which we call as a mirror pair. So if I have an export out of BAA at intertie X, and then I'm going to also have an import in BAB associated with that same transfer location. This way we can mirror the megawatts being scheduled between the balancing authority areas to accurately come up with a pricing and accounting from a settlement perspective of that energy. What we have is three types of ETSRs in WEAM. When we went live, we first started out with the static and dynamic ETSR, and these were transfer of energies that was being optimized by the market. However, later on, I think it was in around 2017, we introduced the concept of a base ETSR. And this is an explicit ETSR that was to reflect bilateral transfer of energy between two BAAs. So this was, energy that was contracted in the bilateral market or through contractual arrangements that had to be base scheduled into the market and to ensure that we know exactly what the reference point for energy transferring between two BAAs. Now this can get updated between the submission of the base schedule and the time we do the market run, the 50-minute market run. And what we introduced when we introduced the base ETSR was this concept of choosing to settle or not. It's an election on whether or not to settle that base ETSR. If we can go on to the next slide. And I'll get into more of how that choice introduced a level of complexity and potential issue in settlements. So what is WEAM, transfer and congestion revenue? I kind of addressed this a little bit. In WEAM, transfer revenue is transfer congestion revenue. We do not differentiate it explicitly from internal congestion revenue when considering the marginal cost of congestion. We differentiate it when we're calculating the marginal cost of congestion breakdown pricing, which tells you if it's a transfer limit that is binding, you have a 50-50 split or 100 to 0 split between WEAM and ISO. This is going to be split, and then you're going to add in your internal congestion. So when settlement sees this breakdown price, they're not broken down by this is your transfer limit congestion and this is your internal congestion. It's just one single congestion for that BAA. And then at each nodal location, if you sum it up, the BAA's congestion into a total, that becomes the marginal cost congestion for that nodal location. What this marginal cost congestion breakdown price allows us to do is to, in WEAM, I can settle with the resources at the marginal cost congestion, the LMP, and then I can determine in settlements what portion of that congestion belongs or should be allocated to that BAA, and what congestion should be allocated to another BAA. So how to distribute the congestion rent, particularly associated with the ITC and the transfer scheduling limits. So in WEAM, as I kind of hinted at, when you have two WEAM BAAs, the transfer constraint, when it's binding, that congestion rent or revenue is split 50-50 between the two BAAs. if it's between the WEA and BA and the ISO, the allocation is 100% to 0 to the WEA and BAA versus the ISO. Whereas the ITC or internal congestion is allocated 100% to BAA, which is model. So, the internal congestion and ITC is a type of internal congestion, and we allocated 100% to the BAA. Okay, so now that's a little bit of history where we got to WAM. Now, I want to talk a little bit about, the next slide is an issue that we identified a couple of years ago with asymmetrical wheeling. A little history on this is that we had a situation where we had to have an update to an import schedule in one balancing authority, WEA balancing authority area. It had to wheel through another WEA balancing authority area and export out. It also, we had a similar situation later on where it basically wheeled through two additional balancing authority areas and wheeled out. So basically, this is a wheel through schedule. And what we found is that when we're having a wheel through energy like this, and there's a power balance constraint violation or a price separation based on the power balance constraint shadow price in one of the BAAs, it creates a cost shift, an inappropriate cost shift between the BAAs. And the fact that we allow for optional settling of the base ETSR deviations, and that's updates to the base ETSR in reference to the base scheduling of that base ETSR. This compounded the shifting of cost. And so it was a part of the real-time settlement review initiative, and we walked through how this cost shift was occurring. And the next couple slides are basically the slides which walk through as to how it settled prior to how it's settling today and why we need to now make a distinction with EDAM. So if we go to the next slide.
James, before we move to the next slide, there is a question in the chat that I just want to read out just to make sure that we're not losing anyone here. The question is, what happens to the price differences in the marginal loss component of LMP?
Okay, the price difference of marginal loss stays within the BAA, in which the node is modeled. So if you have an import or generator at A going to load at B, you're going to have a price separation of the marginal loss. That loss is going to stay within each BAA. So I'll take it from the generator to the transfer location. That marginal cost of losses will be allocated to the entity within BAA. And then from the import to the load, that price differences on the marginal cost of loss will stay within the BAB, the entity for BAB. And that's because the losses are occurring and the transmission between those locations within the BAA. And therefore, we are going to consider that marginal cost of loss within that BAA.
Okay, thanks, James. Looks like that was helpful. And we did get another chat question asking, how is the transmission limit for the transfer constraint determined if both intertie and intertie transmissions are considered?
Read that again. I want to make sure I heard the whole thing correctly.
Yeah, so how is the transmission limit for the transfer constraint determined if both intertie and intertie transmissions are considered?
Okay, so if you have a transfer location, the transmission limit is at a same location as an intertie where you have people bidding in, it's going to, That'd be the best way to phrase it. When the EAM or WEAM or EDAM BAAs submit the available transmission capacity for that transfer resource, that ETSR, we're going to match it up with the mirror resource, and that's going to set the transfer limit for that ETSR. So if it was 1,000 megawatts at the transfer capability, but each of the two BAAs submit 800, then we're going to limit that transfer resource to 800. And so what happens is each of the ETSRs have the transfer limit on it, and we have the entity submit, or the transition provider submit the limit for that transfer. Now, when it comes to bidding at InterTie, that's one of the reasons why we have to have the ITC, is we will consider the economic bids and the transfer together to ensure that they're within the transfer limit, because we have our scheduling limit for that transfer, that location, and the ETSRs and the bids cannot exceed that ITC, which is then where you're getting into, it's now coming into the balancing authority area. I have looked at the available transmission for the bids. I've looked at the ETSR transmission limit, and as long as they don't exceed the ITC, then we can use the transmission. We go more into that into examples. George, did you want to add to that at all?
No, you're doing good.
Okay. So, if there's no other questions in the chat, I'd like to move on to the asymmetric wheeling issue itself. So what we identified in that situation which I described, we identified where I had to import from a non-EAM BAA or WEAM BAA, introducing into a WEAM BAA4. It was wheeling through WEAM BA2 into WEAM BA5 and then out to a non-WEAM BA, which is 3. Now, the old methodology of pricing this, particularly from an energy perspective, was we took the price of the system margin energy price plus the power balance constraint price of, let's say in this case, for going from BA4 to BA2, the power balance shadow price of BA4 plus the power balance shadow price of BA2, and just divided it by 2. And this gave us the same price for leaving a balancing authority area and going into a balancing authority area. And then from the, if it left again, we use the same type of pricing. Now, when you don't have any power balance shadow price constraint, when ETSRs are not binding, then this is not an issue because the system margin energy price is the same going from the non-EAM BA area to another non-EAM BA area, just wheeling through the WEAM. Where it becomes a problem is once you have a power balance constraint violation within a BAA. And if we settle the transaction, the base ETSR. So I go to the next slide. This is a demonstration of what happens when I have BAA2 has the ETSRs are binding and I have a $530 price of the energy plus the shadow price for the BA. The energy, marginal energy price is $30, but I'm indicating here that I have a PVC shadow price of $500 in BA2. What makes it even more inflated is that I have a base ETSR that is settling in between BA4 and BA2, but not between BA2 and BA5. So I'm pricing the import at $30. Okay, so that's a $3,000 payment for the import. When I go to show that it leaves BA4, I'm charging it at $28,000. And then I'm moving as an import into BA2 of $28,000. Now what this does is there's a cost shift. There's a cost shift between BA4 and BA2 of $25,000 because all of that energy or that power balance constraint price should have remained in BA2. I should have priced the export at $30 and the import at $530. And then what made it even worse was I don't have settling the base ETSRs going from BA2 to BA3. So now you have an additional cost of $3,000 that is not being accounted for as part of the energy. So what we did is we looked at this scenario and said, well, how do we solve it? And what we came up with is a short-term solution and then a long-term solution. The short-term solution, if you can go to the next slide, is that we were going to require, one is all, and I'll get more into it, all base ETSRs to settle, but we looked at the pricing first. What should be the price of the energy exporting out of a BAA, transferring out versus transferring into a BAA? And what we determined is that the energy transferring out from BA4 should have been priced at its system marginal energy cost plus its power balance shadow price, and not as a 50-50 between BA4 and BA2 shadow prices. And the import into BA2 should be priced at the system marginal energy price and its shadow price. Now, having the base ETSRs automatically settle then resolves the issue on the second side where I didn't have any energy settling, but now I will have the export out of BA2 and the imports into BA5 settling, and then the export out into the non-EDAM BAA3 would also be priced. And if you go to the next slide, you can see what the outcome of this solution would be. If you go to the next slide. Okay. So what happens is the EAM or WMBA4, it is now neutral. I have the import being paid at $3,000. I have the transfer base ETSR deviation export being charged $3,000 for BA4. For BA2, I have the import being paid or accounted for as $53,000, as well as the export being accounted for at $53,000. And then a similar thing happens with EAM BA5. It's $3,000 import with a $3,000 export. This ensures that there is no cost shift when you have wheeling energy that's being reflected in the base ETSRs, and we are settling. And so this was a short-term solution. And so if I go to the next slide, what we identified is that we need to have a short-term solution and a long-term solution. And I'll take questions in a second. The short-term solution was, one is mandatory settlement of base transfer deviation. This ensures that any wheeling through energy that is being captured by a base transfer update is going to settle all the way through the wheeling transaction, and therefore will wind up in neutrality, being okay. And then settlement would be based upon the respective SP tie price, which would then reflect the fact that it's the system margin energy price plus the power balance shadow price of that BAA. Now, there can be some additional separation if you have an ITC, but that is an appropriate separation because it's internal. We also made a determination that we need to have a long-term solution. And taking into consideration at the time of where we were going with EDAM, we determined that it was best to incorporate the power balance shadow price as part of the marginal energy component of the LMP for each BAA. This allows us to separate the cost of the energy or related to the ETSR binding or congestion, which would cause a higher dispatch of resources within the BAA, causing a price separation in the energy. And that price separation, that power balance shadow price, would be reflected in the energy cost of that BAA. Currently, as we said, as part of the marginal cost congestion component, we would end up eliminating a system-wide marginal energy cost, and we would have its own, each BAA would have its own marginal energy cost. And then the other big thing is that all of the transfers would have to settle. We're no longer going to settle just the base ETSR deviations. We would end up settling day-ahead transfers, base base ETSR deviation settlement, as well as dynamic and static ETSR energy. We would have to settle all that at the ST-TI LMP. Now, I think this is a good start as to how we're got to separation between the transfer revenue and the congestion revenue. As part of this asymmetrical wheeling, we identified that we needed to separate out congestion associated with the ETSR binding and resulting in a power balance constraint shadow price starting to go up versus having it embedded within the marginal cost of congestion. So I'll open up for some questions here.
Okay, let's go to Callie Wells.
Hey, James. It's Callie Wells with WPTF. So I appreciate you walking us through this. I just want to make sure I understand the change in terms of price formation. So congestion now that occurs on transfers will be added to what's called now the SMEC. So going forward, there will not be the same system marginal energy cost component across all the system. Each BA will have its own SMEC.
It'll have its own marginal energy cost, yes. You have a BAA marginal energy cost. Now it can't, if I don't have the transfers binding, those marginal energy costs should be the same. But as soon as we have a binding transfer constraint, then you're not able to import or export additional energy. So now you're adjusting your marginal energy cost by that power balance constraint price, shadow price.
Okay, but congestion that occurs internal to the BAs will still be reflected in the congestion component. So now, essentially, if you look at all the congestion costs, transfers and congestion, they're going to be kind of split. Some will be in a congestion component and some will be embedded in the marginal energy price. But just looking at that marginal energy price, you don't know how much of that is congestion and how much of that really is what's called today the SMEC. Am I understanding that change correctly?
I won't say you won't be able to identify, but you should be. We will be able to identify the amount of the marginal cost of energy, and then as well as the power balance shadow constraint price. But it will be all embedded within the BAA's marginal cost of energy.
Okay, so if we're just looking at the marginal energy price component, we're kind of losing a little transparency there, but addressing the issue that you just walked us through.
It's addressing the issue. We will still publish the power balance constraint shadow price, so you will still be able to see that, and then from that we can determine what the underlying BAA marginal energy cost is. So the transparency is still there, it's just shifting a little
Okay. All right. I'll have to think through that one, but thank you. Oh, and actually, since I
The
have
other
you,
thing
I did. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Okay. The other thing that helps us is currently when we do this marginal cost congestion breakdown, this is being performed by the market as an after the market function. Now, because we're able to separate these costs apart, it'll be more transparent in our settlement system because I will be able to identify the cost differences between the two BAAs associated with the binding constraint, and we will do that distribution that we are talking about a little bit later. So it's actually becomes even more transparent than less transparent.
Through the settlements process.
Yes.
Okay. I appreciate that. And actually, since I have you, if you don't mind, I did submit a question in chat. I'm not sure where a natural spot would be to ask this because it's a little bit of a tangent from what we talked about. But do you mind clarifying when you were kind of a few slides prior to this, when you were going through the submitting self-scheduled transfers, can you confirm or help me understand, can third-party generators also submit those self-scheduled transfers, or can only EDAM entities submit those? We're trying to figure out who has the ability to submit those self-scheduled transfers.
So it's going to be dependent upon if you have ETC to our right. Is when we set up the transfers, we are going to have an association of those transfers to scheduling coordinators based upon their rights. So if we have established ETC to our rights, then yes, you can self-schedule those transfers. If you don't, then it will be, if you want it self-scheduled, then the entity would be the party that should submit it, unless, George, you have a different design that I can think of.
I'm sorry, I wasn't following up the question here.
Okay. Third-party customers without ETC tours, can they submit self-schedules on the transfers? And I believe we have said is no. The entity has.
We allow self-schedules for ETSRs for specific scenarios, but what is the question regarding that?
So bucket 2 transmission pathway 1, can third-party generators submit self-scheduled transfers for under pathway 1 of bucket 2? And I know it's a little bit of a tangent, so I apologize, but we just had that question we'd like to better understand.
Oh, well, technically yes. However, it's going to be a waste of a useful capacity if this is not declared as a bucket 1. So can we support it? Can we do it? Can we allow it? Yes. All we're saying here is that if you're self-scheduling a transfer because you're exercising your rights to schedule across PAAs, then that self-schedule is actually going along with either self-schedules or bids from source to sink, right? So it will make most sense for this transfer to be a bucket 1 transfer so that you can get the full benefit of it in the resource efficiency evaluation of the 2 BAAs that are involved. If it's declared as a bucket 2, obviously this is not going to be considered in the resource efficiency evaluation, so it's a loss. That's all we're saying. It better be a bucket 1 transfer to make a full use of it. If it's not declared as a bucket 1, we can still do it. We can still support it. It's just, it's not very useful. That's what we're saying.
Okay, and I won't get into the debate again about bucket 1 and bucket 2. Just functionally speaking, we were just wanting to confirm that they can. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you,
Let's go to Tong.
This is Tong Wu from WAPA. Can you hear me?
Yeah, Tong, you're a little bit soft, but I can hear you.
Okay. Let me get closer. Is it better?
Yep.
Okay. Since we're on this page, I'm going to ask a question about marginal energy component, and then I would like to go back and ask some question about ITC and transfer limits. So marginal energy component, my understanding is that this is simply a reference point. It depends on the selection of reference bus or select bus. Now, if you have a balancing constraint for each BAA, then it would create a market separation. And then the marginal energy component will be different for each BAA. The difference is the result of market separation constraint. I use this term market separation constraint because before MRTU, once upon a time, we had market separation constraint. Each SC has to balance their portfolio, so each SC has its own balancing constraint. The result of that each SC has a different reference energy price. So there will be a similar concept. But here, you're artificially adding a shadow price to the global reference and call it a marginal energy component. When you do this, do you change all the other components like a congestion or loss? Basically, you're changing reference bus. When you change it, you have to change everything. Otherwise, this won't be consistent. So it's like if you use Earth at the reference point to measure speed, then you cannot use the sun as a reference point for speed. Now, if you change, you have to change the whole thing. Otherwise, all these parts would not be consistent. So that's my kind of first question.
Hi, Tom. This is George Angelides. You're comparing this proposal with what we have in place right now in EIM, where we're essentially using the ISO balancing authority area as a reference to calculate the SMAC. So we're pivoting away from this because we don't want to use any balancing authority area as a reference for that. And we realize that each balancing authority area could have its own marginal energy price, which would be the shadow price of its power balance constraint. So now you can see that each BAA is a reference for its own marginal price. And then if there are any kind of constraints that are binding between BAAs, like transfer limits or ITCs that could constrain multiple transfers, for example, then that will result in different prices across the BAAs. Now that the power balance constraint shadow price for each BAA will reflect this, will reflect the transfer limit. It won't reflect the ITC limit unless the ITC is full enclosure of the BAA. Then it affects the power balance constraint. The fact of the matter is that you have a better representation of the LMPs, where now you understand that in each BAA you have a marginal energy price, which is reflecting the cost of serving the next increment of demand in that BAA. And then you still have the decomposition that we have today in the LMP, where you have additional components for marginal losses, for marginal congestion, and for marginal greenhouse gas. So instead of going across all BAAs and saying we want to have a system marginal energy price, which will require to take one of these BAAs as a reference, and what we do today in EIM, we're picking up the ISO as a reference, and then we capture the price difference between BAAs. Now we represent it as congestion in the congestion component, and then that's how the LMP difference is shown up. Instead of that, we're saying each BAA has its own marginal energy price, and the difference between the marginal energy price across BAAs is because you have transfer limits that are binding. So we separate the congestion that you may have on a transfer, all right, and we say this manifests as difference between marginal energy prices across BAAs from the congestion that you can have either internally in a BAA or at an intertie schedule limit like an ITC, which you'll see that in the marginal congestion component. Again, there is one exception. If the ITC is full enclosure, then you'll still see it in the marginal energy price. So the total LMP doesn't change. As you mentioned, the reference changes, so there is some shifting between the components. But we believe that this proposal is more reasonable going forward with multiple BAAs, and particularly with the fact that we're separating how revenue that is collected across the market footprint because of binding constraints is distributed differently now. So we're separating transfer revenue because this has different rules for distribution, the 50-50 rule, for example, or under pathway 1, it goes to the customer. And the congestion, which is part of your congestion offset in each BAA, and has a different distribution. So we think that all of these components, they come together and make sense with this proposed change.
Yeah, thanks, George, for the explanation. I think, I understand what you're saying. You're going from one approach. You believe by doing so everything is still mathematically correct. And I didn't do the derivation. I don't even understand all of this. So I don't know whether it's correct. But if you actually have a power balancing constraint for each of the BAA, and you derive the mathematical formulas, when you calculate the difference between the energy component of two BAAs, would that actually equal to this so-called PBC shadow price? I don't know that. It could be. This seems like just adding something to it, believing it is true. It may not be true, but I don't know. It's not true either.
Yeah, we have done simulations and we have showed examples, right? We even have Excel examples, but we also showed examples of how the transfers work with the price formation and even settlement. And I'm sure you'll see some examples here. I think James has a set of examples to show. So in a very simple system where you have two BAAs and you have a transfer between the two and it's hitting the limit, what you will see is that the power balance constraint shadow price in each BAA is different by the shadow price of that transfer congestion. So we have seen this in our simulations. We have seen this mathematically in deriving the solution, and we have seen this in Excel spreadsheets that simulate that solution. So we know it's right.
Okay, so if I trust you, George. If you did the mathematical derivation and you find out actually the market separation constraint difference actually equals to just the shadow price of the transfer, if you prove that, that's fine. But if you said I did some Excel example, well, Excel examples are too simple, and then maybe radio system or may ignore a lot of other constraints components. So I'm not sure an Excel example can justify this.
Well, maybe I can help a little more here. And first of all, I don't like to refer to a market separation constraint that you're referring. What we mean here is the power balance constraint. That's what we have. So the difference between the shadow prices of the two power balance constraints of the two BAAs is the shadow price of the transfer scheduling limit, of the binding scheduling limit between the two. Now, in EIM today, actually, the way we calculate the solution, we do have that formulation. We have the first pricing that comes out of the pricing run has a marginal energy component for each BAA based on the shadow price of the power balance constraint, and then we reformulate, we transform these prices for publication. We're using the ISO as a reference. Okay, so then what we publish is the SMEC, which is really the ISO power balance constraint shadow price. And we do that to facilitate the BAA level, the EIM BAA level market power mitigation, which is triggered today by a positive shadow price for a power balance constraint in a BAA, because we use the ISO as a reference. But we could be doing all this with the new proposal, and this is how it's first calculated, where each BAA has its own marginal energy component based on the power balance shadow price of that BAA, and we could be conducting the market power mitigation comparing the shadow price of a BAA with that of the ISO, and say if it's bigger, then there is an input somewhere, an input constraint from the ISO to that BAA, which triggers the BAA level mitigation. So it's all equivalent. We're not really materially changing the problem. And the proof of that is that we're actually solving in EIM the same way. We're just transforming the prices to facilitate market power mitigation, because it was originally set up as a trigger to have a positive marginal energy cost in the BAA. So it's all equivalent. We're not making any material change to the formulation, pricing formulation.
Okay, I don't, understand all detail, but thanks, George. Let's switch topic. ITC and transfer constraint. This is a very important because it has to do with bucket 2, bucket 3 uplifts. I think the transfer constraint is something new from last time. I just realized that transfer constraint is not ITC; it's something different. So there might be, many aspects that are different. First of all, who this transfer constraint who is applied to? Is transfer constraint only for the EDAM BAAs, or this could be applied to EDAM BAA and non-EDAM BAA? If you can ask that first question, that probably help me a little bit to just orientate my thoughts.
Yeah, that's a good question, Tom. By the way, the transfer constraint is not new. We have it in EIM, right? It manifests between EIM BAAs today, where we have dynamic transfers that are limited. They have a scheduling limit, and you see that scheduling limit, sometimes it's binding, and that causes price separation between the LMPs across BAAs, across EIM BAAs. It's just that now, since we're using in EIM the ISO BAA as reference for a SMEC, you will see that shadow price from the transfer constraint as part of the marginal congestion component in the LMPs of other BAAs, because you have the ISO as a reference. So now, because each BAA will have its own marginal energy price based on its own power balance constraint shadow price, you won't see that component anymore as part of the marginal congestion component of the LMP. It's really going to be embedded in the marginal energy component. So you'll see there's a price differential between marginal energy between BAAs. Now, to answer your question, we only have transfers between BAAs in the market footprint. So in EIM, it's between EIM BAAs. In EDAM, it's only between EDAM BAAs. You can have EIM BAAs that are not in EDAM, and they're treated as non-market BAAs in EDAM. So you don't have transfers between an EDAM BAA and a non-EDAM BAA. We can only have import-export self-schedules at those interties, right? So these are not transfers. You only have transfers between EDAM BAAs in EDAM. When you go to EIM, those day-ahead transfers are all to EIM as base transfers. Then you can have additional base transfers submitted from EIM BAAs in EIM that are not in EDAM. And you can also have now dynamic transfers between EIM BAAs in EIM. Does this clear this out a little bit?
Yeah, that helps. That helps. Just to be very clear, let me give you a very concrete example. Just make sure I understand very clearly. Hypothetically, let's assume that bank would join EDAM and the BPA will not at the beginning. So then any import from Northwest, from the PECI, would be considered ITC and would not be subject to transfer constraints. Would that be correct?
Well, let me see. Are you considering an import from BPA through Captain Jack to bank?
Yeah, to Captain Jack to bank or from Malin to the ISO.
Malin to ISO, okay. So, yes, if BPA is not in EDAM, there's a difference between those two. It could either be an import self-schedule at Captain Jack from BPA to bank, being in EDAM. If it's through Malin, it could be an import self-schedule or bid to the ISO from BPA to ISO, because ISO allows import-export bids at the interties with non-EDAM BAAs, but for other EDAM BAAs, it has to be a self-schedule.
Right. So the transfer constraint would not apply to either Captain Jack or Malin.
In this scenario, no, you don't have a transfer.
Right. Okay.
A transfer is only between EDAM BAAs.
Right. Now, hypothetically, if a bank joins EDAM, then let's say Tesla Tracy branch group would be subject to the transfer constraint. Is that correct?
Yes, you're talking about a transfer between bank and ISO in both EDAM entities.
Right.
Yes, that transfer will have a scheduling limit. Okay, let's be careful here. Because there are different things happening here. So that particular transfer has a scheduling limit which reflects, okay, how much transmission capacity is released to EDAM for that transfer. Okay.
So we have bucket two, bucket one, bucket two, bucket three, right? Would transfer limit apply to all these?
Yeah, each transfer has to have its own scheduling limit. Now, there may be additional constraints on several interfaces between ISO and bank, all right? There may be different ITCs that could constrain multiple transfers, all right? So that's different. That's a different constraint. And I think here is what James is trying to articulate with these examples and these slides is that you have different treatment of a transfer limit, which reflects how much transmission capacity is released to EDAM so that it can be used optimally, with an ITC, which is a BAA constraint, which is driven by liability. So you may have multiple transfers that could be constrained by a simultaneous transfer capability constraint between two BAAs, and this has nothing to do with how much transmission capacity is released on any particular transfer. And we're trying to differentiate between these two concepts because we have a different mechanism for collecting and allocating revenues from those binding constraints. Okay?
Yeah, let's say Tesla Tracy branch group, right? Today you have ITC limit, and at the same time you have flow limit, because right now anything is just, in the day ahead, anything is just radio injection there. You have ITC as a scheduling limit, and then you have your power flow limit. And either one can be binding before the other. So now you have a transfer limit. Would this transfer limit replace the ITC? Would the ITC go away between Tesla and Tracy if hypothetically bank joins EDAM? Or you would simultaneously have three limits: the flow limit, the ITC limit, and the transfer limit.
Okay, by flow limit, you mean the physical branch. When you say branch group, that's a physical constraint. This is an ampere.
Yeah, that's a physical power flow constraint. It's not a scheduling constraint.
Right. I don't think we enforce those physical limits on interties. It's really the scheduling limit that is more limiting. So I think we have scheduling. The ITC is really what we enforce. Physical limits are further into the system, and on your side of bank. So your question is, what will happen to the ITC that is in place today if we can have a transfer, right? And I guess we can look at what happens in EIM today, because bank and ISO are in EIM today, and there is a transfer. There are multiple transfers. So your question should be already answered by what happens in EIM today. If the ITC was the single constraint between bank and ISO at that particular interface, then there is no need to have two constraints, because the constraint is essentially you want to enforce the most limiting constraint. You want to do it on the transfer. So the transmission capacity that should be released for the transfer, collectively, if you have multiple transfers, should not exceed any scheduling limit that you would have on the system, right? So if you have a single transfer, then that's your constraint. Now, if you have multiple transfers and you want to have individually released with their own scheduling limit for regions that you want to, for example, differentiate, you know, you have transfers bucket 1 or you have bucket 2, then you have different ways that they're scheduled, and you want to differentiate them for whatever reason, and you have multiple transfers, the ITC is still in place because you still need the ITC to constrain all the transfers together. So the answer depends on the setup. So the rule of thumb would be if you have a single transfer. Yeah, go ahead, James.
No, sorry, George, Colin. I think we could go through intertie by intertie, but that's not really going to be constructive here. I think at a very, very high level, the best way to look at it is if that intertie or that transfer location is between the EDAM BAA and another EDAM BAA, in this case the ISO, then it would have at least a transfer scheduling limit. There could be a potential ITC if there was a need to limit that transfer when comparative to other transfers, but that would have to be a decision that has to be made later on. But if it's between an intertie is between an EDAM BAA and other non-EDAM BAAs, you're going to have both apply. You're going to have the transfer scheduling limit for the energy that is flowing between the EDAM BAAs, but it's also going to have potentially an ITC because you have to, or you will have an ITC because you have to take into consideration the energy that's being bid in from non-EIM BAAs and potentially other transfer resources at that same location. Malin would be a very good example. Is you can have other BAAs have rights to set up transfers with the ISO, but also have and they could be in EDAM, but also have BPA not in EDAM, and you're going to potentially have to set up an ITC to ensure that we don't exceed the ISO scheduling limit. So I think the answer to a lot of your questions, Colin, is it depends on the intertie and it depends upon what BAAs have joined EDAM.
Yeah, James, thanks. My assumption was that hypothetically that BPA was not joining, but bank was joining. And if you agree with what George's answer, then I'm good with the difference between ITC or transfer regarding non-EDAM BAA or EDAM BAA. But my question now, I still have a question about transfer constraint. James, you mentioned that for transfer revenue, you would consider both intertie constraints and internal constraints. Right. Now, let's say
hold on. So I did not say transfer revenue and considers both those. So transfer revenue is limited to the transfer schedule limit, the transfer constraint, and when it's binding, because that is going to impact the power balance shadow price. If it's an ITC, intertie transmission constraint, that is considered internal congestion and that is part of congestion revenue and not transfer revenue.
Okay,
So
I got you.
I just wanted to correct that.
Oh, okay, got you. So for, yeah, okay, that makes sense. So for transfer constraints, the congestion revenue, transfer revenue, is collected from the shadow price of that transfer constraint itself only. Is that true?
We're going to collect it on the marginal cost of energy differences between the BAAs. And then based upon our previous discussion with George, it should be reflected as that PVC shadow price.
Okay, so if the energy component that is modified by adding the transfer constraint shadow price, then the difference between the price between the marginal energy component of the two BAA would equal to the shadow price of that transfer constraint. Is that right?
Okay. Yes.
Yeah, it depends how you do it. Either you just take it, use the congestion shadow price directly, or you put it into the marginal energy component and then subtract the two and get the same thing. So I just want to make sure I understand it correctly.
Yeah, but from a settlement perspective, this is a settlement perspective, everything is settling at the LMP. And so when I have to take into consideration any price differences that occur within a BAA, I'm going to be using the components of the LMP. I am not going to be going out to the constraints and try and map it to the various modes. We're going to be using the LMP and its components. So that's why I'm referring to it consistently as the marginal energy cost separation between the two BAAs. And what I do, Tong, in a couple slides, is I do a little demonstration of how this occurs. When you have just the transfer constraints binding, another point when the ITC is binding, and one when they're both binding. And maybe it'll help answer any additional questions.
Okay. So when you say you take the difference between the two LMPs, you're not talking about the total LMP. You're only talking about the modified energy component.
So from a BAA perspective, you're going to have each component of the LMP can result, like in real time today in WAM, it can result in neutrality differences between the settlement of load versus the settlement of supply, or demand versus supply. When we do our neutrality calculation, similar like we do in real time, we're going to bring it, we have it in day ahead, but we're extending it further into day ahead. I'm going to look at the energy component differences, the marginal cost congestion differences, as well as the marginal cost of loss differences, to ensure that the costs are completely accounted for correctly for the LMP, because each of those components allocation is a little bit different. And so I have to make sure any neutrality, or in this case, congestion revenue or transfer revenue, is allocated to the appropriate parties.
Okay, so James, thank you very much. And I probably will wait until you go through the examples. My question may or may not be answered at that time. Thanks a lot.
Okay. And I saw Kathy had her hand up. I think she put back down, or did she? Kathy, oh, there she is.
Thanks, James. Just a couple kind of maybe weedy questions, but they're brief. This is Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. So for the individual power balance constraints, today we just have one reference bus. And I was wondering, in the spirit of the history, it would be helpful if you don't mind just reminding the group, the reference bus that we use today, it is distributed, but the locations that are included in the distributed load node, I thought those were all within CAISO BAA. Is that accurate, or has that shifted?
I'm actually going to defer that to George. I don't have the answer to that question.
That's okay.
Thank you.
Hi, Kathleen, this is George. Can you please repeat for me? Thank you.
Yeah, no, of course. So distributed load node, our Slack bus. I believe, I just want to level set with the history because I thought that was helpful how James did that. So, and I think this is an important piece to, like an important underlying component to understand what you're proposing. So today, not under the proposal, but today, it's a single Slack bus distributed with load locations within the CAISO BAA. Is that accurate, or could you clarify?
Oh, yes. So the distributed reference that we use in several places for several calculations is the distributed load in the market footprint, right? So we only distribute in the market footprint. Now, when you formulate a power balance constraint for a BAA, in that power balance constraint, you have the load resources in that BAA that are in there. So the saddle price reflects the next, the cost for serving the next increment of the demand in that BAA. But of course, through transfers, that can be met from anywhere on the grid. So if there are not, so I'm not sure exactly. Okay.
There's a lot of, let me stop you because this is helpful. And so first, okay, yes, the distributed load is from across the market footprint. So the question to level set for everyone is today, when you say market footprint, we are actually distributing the load node, the Slack bus, across the entire EIM. So there's load locations in every single EIM BAA within that distributed node today. Is that accurate?
Yes, that's our reference for calculating marginal losses. Correct.
Yes. Okay, perfect. Okay, so today that's what we have. My question about your proposed change here, like I know we have individual power balance, BAA power balance constraints, but they are included in the MC, the marginal cost of congestion. We still have only one single Slack bus. Under this, the idea of bringing the power balance constraint into the SMEC for every BAA, are you also planning to then have individual BAA reference buses that only have a distributed node for that area to set the SMEC?
Okay. So let's separate a little bit. You're using terminology that may confuse everybody. The term Slack bus is something that is used in the power flow, all right? So the power flow calculation is using a Slack bus as its mechanism to allocate the error from the linearization in each iteration. And in our market that has multiple BAAs in EIM, we're actually enforcing the net schedule interchange that comes from the market solution in the power flow. So you can say that we have a different Slack bus for each BAA. All right, so that the Slack is adjusted separately in each BAA. So it's like you have a Slack that is the distributed load in that BAA alone. All right, but that happens in the power flow, and that's where the Slack bus discussion belongs. In the market solution, okay, there is no Slack bus. Okay. We basically formulate a power balance constraint for each BAA, okay, even in EIM, that's what I was telling Tom. That's how we solve the problem today. So each BAA has a power balance constraint, all right? There is no Slack bus, right? You don't need a Slack bus. The mismatch on that power balance constraint is your net transfer, all right? What goes in and out as transfer, okay? So I wouldn't call it a Slack. It would be a mistake to call it a Slack. So it's your net transfer is the mismatch of your power balance equation. And that happens for each BAA. Now, we transform these prices by picking a BAA as a reference. But this is just a transformation. It doesn't change the calculation or what the prices are. Now, in the power flow, we use the Slack bus for calculating the marginal loss. Okay, so you have to separate between those two concepts. What happens in the network analysis part and what happens in the optimization part, the market optimization part. The notion of the slack bus is something that is used in the network analysis. In the power flow, is used there as a reference to calculate marginal loss coefficients that are used then in the linearized equations in the market to represent marginal losses, all right? But the market per se does not have a thing called slack bus, okay?
Can you hear me, George?
I can hear you.
Okay, great. That was great, first of all. And I appreciate the additional clarity. I am using the Slack, but I mean, network application is an important application. Just trying to level set for the group, when we talk about power balance constraints and how the price formation of a system marginal energy cost is supposed to be set, I mean, these are very these are very foundational principles in market design. And I think it is really helpful for the community and myself to better understand what is the reference bus for, because it's not just losses come out of NA. It's the binding constraints, it's the critical constraints that get modeled in the market. There's a lot of important things that power flow does, so I don't want to discount it and say that's not the market, right? They're in the market.
Just to keep it at a very high level and simple so that, you know, everybody can understand. There is no such a thing as called slack bus or reference bus or anything in the market optimization. When you formulate a power balance constraint for a BAA, it basically says that the mismatch between supply and demand in that BAA is your net transfer, which is algebraic. If it's positive, it's export. If it's negative, it's an import. You have that constraint for each BAA. And the setup price of that constraint reflects what's the marginal cost for serving the next increment of demand in that BAA.
We're sorry. Your conference is ending now. Please hang up.
Oh.
Please ignore that notification.
Okay. All right. So if there is no transfer congestion between the BAAs, then the marginal price for serving the next increment of demand in any BAA is the same. All right, because you have the same marginal energy price across all BAAs. If there is transfer congestion that creates a price separation between the BAAs, now the marginal cost of serving the next increment of demand in each BAA may be different. And these differences, these price differences across BAAs, are reflected in the set of prices of transfer scheduling limit constraints that may be binding in the solution. So I'll stop here. Anything more will probably be counterproductive.
No, I don't think this is counterproductive at all, George. I think this is exactly the kind of conversations that we need to be having, right? So I first want to thank the CAISO and thank James for going through. This is the first time I've seen this proposal that's been hinted at, like specifically walked through. And I applaud you for taking the time to do that and to give stakeholders the time to understand it. These are foundational aspects of the market. So this is worth your time and our time, so thank you. That is very helpful for me to have clarity that you're not planning to change and have multiple power flow analyses being, right? We're still going to be one system. I think that is the underlying thing that needs to be confirmed, is that the market is still solving for a single system solution. And then I will take this back from a policy perspective and see if we believe that SMECs being different by BAA on the premise that we're still solving a single system power flow makes sense from a policy perspective. My intuition is I do not think it makes sense, and I can give you a very simple anecdotal story about the last few weeks to kind of explain and leave you with this thought. And I'll refer back to what Callie said about transparency. I respect that we want more transparency in the settlement process, and I will noodle this use case and see if I can make a suggestion in comments. But from a transparency on the SMEC side, over 10 days of 31st of August, the 9th, I spent almost all day looking at ISO today for all 10 days. And I want to communicate to the CAISO that the SMEC value from the 15-minute market, the 5-minute market that is explicitly called out on those user interfaces is something that I looked at as a guiding light for me as I was in real time struggling to support operations and struggling to support everyone work through that challenging time. And I'm trying to think through how to help you address your issue of cost shifting while not removing the transparency on what the system we are solving as a whole marginal energy cost is, because that is there's not a lot of data available to third parties and to folks trying to manage in real time, and it's a really important one. So I just want to leave you with that anecdote that there is a important use case to keep that transparency in place, but I recognize your concerns, and I will take it back and think about if we can provide you with some alternative solutions. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathleen. I see that Tong is back up, but before I go to you, Tong, I wanted to see if there's any questions in the chat first. And you may have put one in the chat as well.
Hi, James. No, it looks like all the questions in the chat have been addressed.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, Tong, you had another question.
Thanks, James. I don't have any question because I started this conversation. I just thought that I want to make a clarification so I don't mislead people. I said the reference and the Slack bus and the loosely, and I want to make a clarification that the reference bus or reference node does not have to be the same as the Slack bus. The Slack bus is for, like George said, for power flow to pick up the losses, and the reference bus is used to determine what the system energy component is. And this reference can be a distributed or can be a single one. My understanding was the ISO had only one. But if you have multiple ones, that's also possible. Then you need to have separate power balancing constraints for each BAA. But if you don't have separate power balancing constraints for each BAA, but you want to introduce another component to the single system power balancing marginal energy component, then basically you're trying to massage it to mimic the effect of having a separate power balancing constraint for each BAA. But I don't know whether the two would be equivalent, but I don't have a judgment right now because I don't know. I just raised the question. But I want to clarify that, reference bus can be different from the slide. But I think what Catherine was questioning was really the reference bus, not the slide. If I, confuse the two, make people confused, so I want to make clarification.
Thank you, Tom. So, Kathleen, I see your hand's still up. Am I assuming that it's based on previous comments? Because if so, I'd like to move on. Okay, thanks, Kathleen. So what I'm going to do is we're going to move on to where we are with the proposal today. The first thing I want to do is talk about unlike WEAM, we actually have more than the energy transfer resources now. We are actually going to have transfer resources or transfer revenue for both energy, invalid reserve, and potentially reliability capacity. And now the energy transfer revenue, as we've stated before, it's the price differences between the marginal energy cost component of the LNT across the EDAM BAAs. And as we've noted here, and we talked about it, is the BA marginal energy cost is the shadow price of the power balance constraint of that BAA. Now we also have similar things with imbalance reserve transfer revenue. If the price differences between the imbalance reserve capacity price of that BAA versus another BAA, it could be up or, if we'll compare up to up and down to down. And it's based on the shadow price of the imbalance reserve up or imbalance reserve down procurement constraint of that BAA. And a similar thing for reliability capacity revenue. I didn't want to spend too much time addressing this. Just want to let you know that we are going to have 3 different types of transfer revenue, and they are similarly calculated as the price differences between the imbalance reserve or between the energy imbalance reserve or reliability capacity of one BAA to another. And you should see a price separation when the constraint is binding. Can you go to the next slide? So when we're talking about the collection, I'm going to kind of address this. It's the difference between the import transfer settlement and the export transfer settlement when the transfer constraints are binding. This is all 3. However, when we're going to discuss this in further detail, I'm going to focus mainly on the energy. But based upon feedback from participants as well as these discussions, the ISO is proposing to distribute the transfer revenue differently than we have in WEAM. In WEAM, if it's between 2 WEAM BAAs, it's 50-50. And if it's between the WEAM BA and the ISO, it was 100 to 0, 100% to the WEAM BA, 0 to the ISO. But based upon feedback, the majority or a large portion of the comments supported the idea that the ISO is also turning over transmission to support all of these transfers, and therefore the transfer revenue should be shared between the BAAs evenly. So don't treat the BAAs differently, that they all should get a 50-50 distribution share of the transfer revenue for energy, imbalance reserve, or reliability capacity. Once we've done the distribution, the EDAM BA will allocate any of the transfer revenue that's directly allocated to them further out. Now, we did talk about, I didn't put it in here, or I do have to, is transmission customers who release their rights. They will, by releasing their rights, they get a CRR-like treatment, and which I can identify the megawatts in which it was released to the market, and based upon the amount of transfer that was available and the amount that was used to the point where we are binding, the transfer customer will get a portion of that transfer revenue 100% based upon the amount of transmission it released. For the ISO, what we're proposing to do is transfer revenue with the ISO is we're going to allocate it to meter demand. A lot of discussion has been whether or not this is considered congestion or if this is something that should go offset transmission tax. Right now, we're proposing that the ISO to allocate it directly to meter demand, not meter demand, not measure demand, meter demand, because the load is basically paying for both. If I go to the next slide. Congestion revenue. Now, congestion revenue, this relates to internal congestion within the BAA as well as ITC congestion. This is all being retained within the marginal cost of congestion component of the LMP. It reflects the shadow prices of these binding internal transmission constraints or schedule limits. We'll collect the price differences across nodes within the BAA. The price differences between boundary intertie schedule limits and internal nodes are also going to be collected. And this is going to be allocated out to the EDAM BAA, if it is the marginal cost congestion is within, or the revenue is within that BAA, so the internal congestion revenue, as well as any ITC congestion revenue associated with that BAA, since it's where it's binding, they'll be allocated to the EDAM entity, and similar to the ISO. The ISO, we will do is another sub-allocation, is we will use the congestion revenue associated with these internal constraints, as well as ITC, to fund the CRRs, and then if there's anything left over, or any additional congestion that needs to be allocated out, then that'll be allocated out to measure demand. So the thing that's changing between WEAM and the first proposal and this proposal is that the ITC congestion revenue, or the congestion revenue associated with internal congestion and ITC congestion, is going to stay the same. It's allocated to the EDAM or EAM BAA. And for ISO, the difference is, instead of allocating it straight to measure demand, we have a CRR mechanism we have to account for first and then measure demand. And then for transfer revenue, or transfer congestion revenue, if you want to refer to it as that is going to be split 50-50 instead of having it 50-50 between EDAM BAAs and then 100% between EDAM B and the ISO. So we're having a consistent treatment across all BAAs with the EDAM footprint when it comes to transfer revenue. Okay, if we move on to the next slide. So what I wanted to do here is I created 3 different scenarios to demonstrate how the transfer revenue and ITC, congestion revenue associated with ITC is collected, and when the various constraints are binding. The first one I'm going to look at is the transfer schedule limit is binding. In this scenario, this is basically the bid-in information. In BAB, I have generator 3 has bid in 500 megawatts at $20. Generator 4 has bid in 500 megawatts at $30, and the load within BAB has 550 megawatts as a price taker. BAA has an import bid at 200 megawatts at $50. Generator 1 has 600 megawatts at $60. Generator 2 has 500 megawatts at $40. Its load is 800 megawatts, and it's also a price taker. Under this scenario, the available transmission capacity that was released for the ETSRs is 200 megawatts import and export directions. And then I have an ITC, ISL/ITC limit of 500 megawatts once it gets into BAA. Now, under this solution, I'm going to try not to go fast, but under this solution, the 500 megawatts in BAB from generator 3, that's going to be dispatched first to account for 500 megawatts of the load within BAB. Then I'm going to dispatch 500 or 50 megawatts of generator 4 to meet the load within. Sorry, I got cut off right there. But I can dispatch an additional 200 megawatts to serve load within BAA from generator 4 because its bid-in price is at $30, whereas the lowest price within BAA from a generation and the import is at $40. So I will dispatch the 200 megawatts. Potentially, we could have dispatched even more, except I have a constraint at the based upon the ATC limit of 200 megawatts. What that means is my transfer scheduling limit is now binding. I cannot get more than 200 megawatts from BAB. So now I have to dispatch internally in BAA for its internal generation supply. So I'm going to dispatch 500 megawatts of generator 2 to meet the 500 megawatts of internal load. I've already accounted for 200 megawatts coming from BAB, which means that I have 100 megawatts I can dispatch between generator 1 or the import, but since the import is a bid-in price of $50, I'm going to dispatch the import for 100 megawatts. So if we go to the next slide, this is the end result. So the generator 3 was dispatched 500, generator 4 was dispatched a total of 250, 50 internally, 200 to transfer over. The marginal energy price for BAB is $30. That's based upon generators 4 marginal bid price, and it's the next megawatt of energy that can be dispatched within the BAB was at $30. So that's the marginal energy price for BAB at $30. Whereas BAA, the marginal unit is the actual import. It has a ability to dispatch an additional megawatt of energy at $50 if it was needed within BAA. What this creates is that I have a price separation of energy between BAB and BAA. This price separation is $20 because the export is going to be charged at 200 megawatts at $30. The import is going to get paid 200 megawatts at $50. So this creates a $4,000 transfer revenue between the two BAAs. This transfer revenue is going to be distributed to each BAA entity at $2,000 apiece. Now, what we're assuming here is that I didn't have any transmission released as part of Pathway 2. This is all Pathway, Bucket 1, Pathway 1, if you want to call it, RSC transmission. But because we're also not at the ITC limit in BAB, I don't have any internal congestion associated with the ISL ITC, so that I'm not collecting any additional congestion revenue within BAA or BAB. And so the only thing we have to look at distributing is the transfer revenue. Now I can continue going on to slides, or I can take questions after each scenario. It looks like Tong has a question.
Tong? Did Tong have a question?
Yes. I have a question about limit of this 200 megawatt transfer. Let's suppose that BAA has some internal transmission limits. So from BAA's point of view, 200 megawatt is the maximum. Although they're altogether 500 megawatt that can go through the intertie between A and B. But from BAA's point of view, only 200 megawatt. For BAAB, there is no constraint inside BAAB. So would this still be a 50-50 split, or you would give the 100% to BAA? Because this limit is really because of the internal constraint.
So let's unpack that a little bit. So the ISL ITC in this case is across the interties in which we allow for economic bidding, as well as a transfer location. They may or may not be the same intertie location. The limit that's being set for the ETSR is based upon BAA and BAA submitting their available transmission capacity, and we take the lower of the two submitted levels. So let's say BAAB had submitted 300 megawatts of available transmission capacity, but BAB says, I am only going to limit my release of transmission at this transfer location to 200. So now that limits the transfer capability between BAB and BAA to 200 megawatts. there isn't not necessarily the 500 megawatt ISL ITC is not explicitly tied with the transfer limit, but we have to take the consideration of the transfer capability as well as the transmission that was released for economic bidding into consideration when that energy flows into BAA. Does that help, Tom?
Yeah, that helps a little bit. Yeah, in general, you're describing very general. Let me give you a very specific hypothetical scenario, still hypothetical. Let's say this point actually is Tesla Tracy, from Tesla to Tracy, from the ISO to bank. And the ISO has a branch group limit for Tesla Tracy. Top of my head, I don't remember what it is. Let's assume it's 500. The max is your example. And then some bank participant wants to import power from the ISO to bank using WAPA transmission inside. But this entity does not have 500. This entity has only 200 megawatt of transmission inside bank. So although the branch group limit is 500 from ISO, branch group point of view, but really there's only 200. And from the ISO side, there's no limit. But from bank side, there's a limit. And then the 200 megawatt costs transfer revenue. So who would get this transfer revenue?
The transfer revenue is split 50-50 between the two BAA. Because
between the ISO and the bank?
Yes, because in order to facilitate the transfer, you're using transmission from the ISO as well as transmission from bank to facilitate the 200 megawatt transfer capability.
Okay. Thanks. That clarifies.
Okay. Thanks, Tom. Doug Boccioni, you have your hand up.
Hi, this is Doug Boccioni for the Bay Area Municipal Transmission Group. Thank you for these examples and the discussion. I think it's really helpful. I just have two questions. One is you mentioned that if a party has rights within the BAA to the boundary, let's say it's BAB, and they contribute those rights, they would get 100% of the revenues, but is what you're saying is would they get 100% of the revenues that otherwise would have been allocated to that BAA?
Okay, let's say in this example, 50 megawatts was the transmission customer who released his rights. They would get 50 megawatts times the $20. They have, and the assumption is they have rights to go all the way through from BAB to BAA, and they're releasing those rights to be utilized by the market. And so therefore, by releasing it, they're going to get the CRR-like product. I think I'm going to refer to it as TRR, transmission revenue rights product, that allows them to get 50 megawatts times the $20 because we are at the limit. So 150 of it was RS, bucket one, and then 50 was the pathway two.
So, but what if their rights were only to the boundary of BAB and they didn't have rights in BAA?
Well, then they are turning over you're talking about internal transmission at that point to get from the generator to the transfer and not across the transfer. Pathway two is referring to the transmission to get across from the BAA.
Yeah, I guess
at that point they would not. Go ahead.
Yeah, if I give a more specific example, I mean, let's say someone has the rights to the California border on transmission from the Northwest, but they don't have rights within California, would they get half of the transfer revenues? And then the second scenario, if they have rights to the border and they have rights in California to take it away from the border, then in that scenario, would they get 100% of the transfer revenues, assuming they release those rights?
I'm going to have to think about that distinction because the way we've viewed it is to allow for the transfer capability to get from BAB to BAA using pathway 1. You have to have the right to facilitate that transfer all the way into, in this case, California, as you described it. And by having it as a 50-50 split, and think off the top of my head is I would expect that they would get 100% because I guess I need to think about that and get back to you on that one, Doug. I'm afraid of speaking off the top of my head on that one.
Sure, great. I appreciate that. Thanks. And then just a question about the congestion revenue rights piece of it. It seems like I think what you're basically saying is for the ISO, you're going to keep the CRR treatment the same because you're still going to sort of track the impact of the flows on the ISL ITC limit. What would happen if all between two BAAs with CAISO, if all the adjacent BAAs were in EDAM, and then therefore there would no longer be any intertie scheduling or bidding? What would be the impact on the CRRs there? I mean, are you still going to compute the sort of the downstream flow limit impacts and therefore still settle intertie CRRs, or at that point would those intertie CRRs need to be settled based on transfer revenues instead of just going directly to measured demand?
Well, I believe that is something I'd like to get input on because right now you can have ITCs established that cover multiple ETSRs and ETSR locations, and if that causes the ITC to bind, then you still will have congestion revenue that can be facilitated for CRRs. And what I think you're getting into is what is transfer revenue? Should that be considered congestion that should be used to offset congestion revenue rights, or is it something else? And I think I'd like to opine and have you guys tell me or give me some suggestions as to what you consider it should be. I think you've done it once already, Doug. I'd like to hear others as well. Is under that scenario, should the transfer revenue be considered as congestion and used to fund a CRR, or should it be just allocated to measure demand or even allocated to offset tax?
Great. Yeah. Okay. We'll comment on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Doug. I think, Stuart, your hand's up.
James, thanks. So, James, in this example, you've got basically a single ETSR import-export. But if I'm following the registration process correctly, you could have conceivably, more than one ETSR associated with different transmission rights that would make up the same transmission capacity. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And in that instance, is the market looking for the total of the individual ETSRs, the total transfer capacity, and when it binds, there is transfer revenue? And I ask because earlier in the day, you were talking about Malin and breaking out BPA. So I'm just trying to understand, are you taking a kind of global transfer capacity and seeing if it binds, or could there be instances where there's different treatment depending on the scenario?
So there won't be a different treatment, and so the way the market solves, it will look at let's say in this case BAB, it will look at BAB's net transfer capability. It will look at all of its transfer capability to all the BAAs. And when it does not have the ability to either transfer out or transfer in additional capacity, then it becomes binding. And therefore, when we do the distribution to the transfer revenue, because the power balance constraint is now binding. You're now getting a separation across the entire BA footprint. We're not going to have it bind by transfer location by transfer location. It's going to be on the footprint.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Jeff? And I know we're running really late. I'd like to get to all the next two slides and then leave some time open for April. We're going to address settlements in our settlement working group. So Jeff, if we can make this quick, or if you want to wait until I do the other two scenarios, that'd be great. You tell
Thanks,
me,
James.
Jeff.
I understand it's getting towards the end here, but I want to have a chance to weigh in on this because this is, I think the issue here is, I just want to emphasize, this is like a extremely important element of the EDAM design. This is the approach that we're talking about here would define how the value of the major interties on the AC and the DC, how they would be allocated through EDAM. And that's 8,000 megawatts potentially of transmission on those lines. It's hundreds of millions of dollars a year. So I think it's really important that we talk about this and make sure there's clarity and understanding amongst the stakeholders about what this proposal does and what it would lead to. Because I've got sort of two broad concerns. One is with the proposal itself. You've talked several times today that the principle for EDAM is 50-50, but unlike transfers between other EDAM entities, in these scenarios when the CAISO is involved, you have a different approach that would not result in a 50-50 split. And we are very concerned that this approach would allocate the majority of the value of these major interties to the CAISO BA. So that's issue number one. But issue number two is we're also concerned that it's just not clear and it's not well understood what the repercussions are here. As I said before, this really matters. This is one of the key elements of the design. And I think the implications of the proposal are being lost in part because of the way it's being communicated. I just think it would be helpful to consider how to explain this more clearly, including an explanation for the rationale for why the CAISO thinks this approach is equitable. Because the issue is this: these major interties are divided, as we know and we've talked about before. We sort of like to refer to it as horizontally. You've got segments without rights holders on the northern side. You have CAISO rights holders on the southern side. The EDAM proposal treats those two sides of those coordinated interties differently. So despite the fact that you have multiple segments that are contributing to enabling these transfers across these coordinated pathways, and they're being funded by outrights holders on the external system as well as entities within the CAISO, rather than sharing 50-50, this proposal is departing from that, and it's treating those two segments differently. And the concern we have is that that approach, in combination with other elements of the design of the EDAM, is going to lead to more schedules, more bids being submitted at COB and at NOB than the external transmission segment can support. And that allows the market software to calculate an inflated congestion value at those interties, at those seams between the OAT rights holders and the CAISO. And that will create an appearance of scheduling congestion where there is none. For example, the most straightforward example is in the middle of the DC line, like we see at Knob, but also at Cobb. But the DC is a good example where you have rights holders on the northern segment and the southern segment, and yet you can have the software see congestion halfway up that line. And the proposal here is that that congestion will be classified as inside the CAISO BA and therefore allocated 100% to the entities within the CAISO. So the net effect is the value of these major interties, hundreds of millions of dollars a year, is not being shared equitably between the entities that are funding that on the northern segment through outrights and the entities in California on the southern side. You could have $30 energy in the Northwest, $50 energy in CAISO. There's $20 of overall value in terms of regional trade, but rather than share that $10 to the northern side, $10 to the CAISO, this departs from that dramatically. And so, we continue to believe we need to step back on this and recognize there are multiple parties that own these rights and fund these coordinated paths. They support a huge amount of regional trade. It's an incredible amount of value. Let's not perpetuate the seams issues that we see in today's world. It would be much more equitable and efficient to say, calculate, allow these lines to be optimized through the market, calculate the congestion across the entire pathway, share that equitably between the different entities that fund those segments, and allow for efficient outcomes through the market to occur. I think that that's consistent with the principles that you're laying out about recognizing shared value when multiple entities bring transmission to the table to support transfers. That seems much more straightforward. And instead, it just feels like this is perpetuating that seams issue at those interties and will lead to inequitable results. And I just continue to not understand the rationale to propose that, because I think as there's more clarity about this, entities that fund the external segments of these coordinated interties are going to look at the proposal and have some significant concerns with it. So if you have some thoughts to that, I would appreciate it, but I really think we need to recognize how important this is and that there's a much more straightforward way to do this in a way that's fair for everyone.
Okay, so I do have some thoughts. Now, I think one of the things that we're trying to address is, and particularly you're talking about knob, is that we have imports at the scheduling point of SOMAR related to knob. Those imports are internal to the ISO, and knob is considered the transfer location between an EDAM or EIM-BAA and other EDAM BAAs, including the ISO. And so if the transfer is binding, if knob is binding, then we will have a power balance constraint separation or energy price separation. And that separation is still being considered to be split 50-50. It's only when you look at additional import capability and that becomes binding, now the ITC becomes binding, then there is the additional ITC that the cost that can be calculated. However, if the ETSR is binding and they're set both at the same limit, let's say the ITC and ISO is at the same limit as the transfer capability into the ISO, and is binding, that means the transfer limit is taking the precedence and it gets the cost, and therefore it gets split 50-50. So I'm not quite following, and I do demonstrate this or talk about this in an example a couple of slides away, why you think we're not taking knob into consideration from the transfer revenue perspective?
Well, first of all, I think we need to recognize there can't possibly be congestion at knob. That's halfway down the line. So just from a physical point of view, you have a DC line supporting transfers from the Northwest to California, and it's being funded by BPA rights holders that own the segment that goes from Big Eddy to knob, and then CAISO and LA on the southern segment from knob to Sylmar. So if we just take a step back, it's a single line creating value. Everything you just described is talking about the mechanics of how the market software determines whether or not the congestion occurred midway up the line. And we already know that that's not realistic. And the concern that we have that leads to that type of result is that the CAISO software will accept bids and schedules at knob delivered to that scheduling location that includes entities that have firm rights on the BPA system, but also entities that don't have any transmission to get to knob. So basically you've got the market software seeing deliveries at knob that aren't supportable by the BPA transmission system on the northern segment of that line. It's completely bypassed whether or not BPA rights can actually support deliveries to knob. If that had been considered, there would be no congestion at knob because there weren't adequate external transmission rights to deliver to that location. But because the CAISO will accept schedules from entities that do have rights and commingle them with entities that don't, that creates this scheduling congestion at that location, which is not consistent with reality, but which reclassifies the congestion. Instead of being labeled transfer revenue, it gets labeled as congestion rent and therefore allocated into the CAISO BA instead of shared. And so what it's leading to is all of this complexity and all of these seams issues associated with how the market sees bids at that location changing who gets the value. Instead of just taking a step back and saying, this is a coordinated line, like I said before, that has funding and contributions from the two different segments to create that value, and that should be shared. Why go down the road of having all this complexity to create that seam halfway down the line and create an inequitable result in terms of the way that the value is allocated because of that?
Hi, Mark. This is George Angelovis. I'd like to correct a statement you made. You said congestion at knob is not realistic. It's not real congestion. It's not true. I mean, we're calling it knob. That's just the name of the scheduling point, but this is really constraints schedules that are imports to ISO at Sylmar using the new firm use that ISO has on the PTCI. So the things that compete for that is a potential transfer with BPA, if BPA were to join EDAM or other entities that they have some rights. But, you know, no, I'm going to limit to BPA. All right. And then you also have potential import bids from participants that they have rights to, they compete to use new firm use rights that the ISO releases on the DC. So you have transfer competing with other participants that are welcome to use the new firm use, that is new firm rights that are released by the ISO based on economics. It's real congestion. I mean, you have a limit. You cannot import an infinite amount of schedules at Sylmar into the ISO. That's your knob ITC. And both transfers and import bids would compete to get a share of that.
But George, first of all, it's just to clarify, it's Jeff, not Mark this time.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. The issue is you are not validating any of the external rights to deliver at that location. What you're saying is that the CAISO is going to calculate congestion at its border as if it's infinitely capable for the external system to support deliveries to that location, because you're including supply that has BPA firm rights. You're including intertie bids that do not have any transmission secured. The resource sufficiency proposal would allow entities to count supply that does not have an E-tag and does not have any BPA transmission associated with it. So if there's congestion on the BPA system, you are not factoring that in. That is completely ignored. That creates more schedules delivered to NOB than the BPA system can support. And that creates the appearance of congestion at CAISO's border, when the fact of the matter is there's not enough external transmission to even get to the CAISO border. The overall DC line starting in Oregon is congested. It's not the CAISO's import location where all of that is occurring. So what we're saying is you have a single line. It has the BPA rights holders, which are not being considered in the calculation. That inflates the number of schedules and bids at NOB or at COB, and that creates the appearance of congestion on the CAISO intertie that is then being allocated 100% to the CAISO. And that's just not accurate.
Turn this around. No, I'm going to turn this around. You're talking about limitations on the BPA side, all right? If that is the case, then you can have an ITC on the BPA side that limits the transfers from BPA out, and that takes care of the limitation on the BPA. And if you need to include import bids that are also going to use the DC to compete with these transfers, you can have an ITC on the BPA side too. Now, it's funny that we're talking about this on the PTCI, assuming BPA is going to be in EDAM day one, so this is probably some discussion we have to do in the future. We can look at situations that are actually happening right now, because what we're proposing here is not much different than what we have in EIM BAAs today. We can look at PowerX. PowerX has an ITC that limits transfers to ISO and Puget at the northern intertie. That ITC is treated differently from transfer limits that could hit independently on those transfers. So we have this distinction today between what is an ITC and what is a transfer limit, and it plays out in EIM today for PowerX. So we're not making any difference here.
But same
concept.
Just to clarify, George, I'm not advocating that the EIM is the right approach. I think that the EIM also has similar challenges, but the fact of the matter is the EIM, the transfer capability with the CAISO and the EIM on the major interties is very small. We're talking about moving to EDAM, where potentially you have much broader participation and more transmission in the market. And so now is the time to get this right. So I'm not advocating for the EIM to be the solution. What we're trying to say is, I mean, what you actually just mentioned, you mentioned one solution would be for BPA to add an export constraint to validate exports from the BPA system to ensure that the deliveries to COB and NOB don't exceed their capability as a solution. I mean, my reaction to that is it almost sounds like you're saying, let's keep the seam in place and hope that others see that that's a problem and start taking unilateral steps to try to fix it on their side. Like, if we recognize there's a seam there and that there's a straightforward solution, why wouldn't we just say, what we really want to do is recognize the shared value of these lines. Let's share that 50-50, like has been proposed elsewhere between other BAs in the EDAM. And then we can allow for that economic optimization to occur without worrying about this seam and the unintended consequences that's created by classifying congestion on one side of a single line versus the other and treating them differently. So, I'm struggling with the proposal that we should just accept this and then hope that others like BPA would take steps on their side.
No, I think we're talking about a specific case for the PTCI, and that's a difficult case because when we're talking about the DC line, really the schedules on the DC line also match the flow. But what we're trying to do here, and I'm not going to speak specifically for the PTCI, that requires more discussion, okay? But in general, we're trying to separate the concept of a transfer, which is between two BAAs, all right, and a scheduling limit on that transfer reflects how much transmission capacity is released to EDAM for having that transfer optimized and have an optimal schedule on it. And then you have a benefit that is collected, shown up as transfer revenue, which is split 50-50 between the BAAs because both BAAs release the transmission capacity for that transfer to happen, as opposed to a constraint, an ITC that constrains multiple transfers, potentially from multiple interties, potentially from multiple BAAs, which is a reliability constraint. It's a power transfer capability constraint, simultaneous power transfer capability constraint. Could be a stability constraint. BPA has those. So this is a completely different constraint. It has nothing to do with the transmission capacity that is released for a transfer. This is an internal BAA-driven reliability constraint. That's internal congestion. Why would the transfer revenue, why would the congestion revenue from that constraint be treated any different than any other internal congestion in the BAA? We're trying to throw this separation. I understand it's getting blurry when it gets to specific situations like the PTCI, which require more discussion, okay, I'll give you that. But the objective of this discussion is to draw the line and separate these two concepts that are starkly different in very obvious cases. The PTCI is not an obvious case, I admit, okay? But the
I actually think
broad.
Sorry, George. Continue.
Yeah, I was trying to say that in general examples, like what I mentioned, it's really clear that these are two different constraints that require different treatment. That's what we're trying to discuss here.
I'm using the DC as an example because I think it's actually the most simple case. It's a single line. The same issue occurs at Cobb as well. The principles that have been articulated, and I think are on one of the slides towards the end, is recognizing the value when multiple entities are bringing transmission to the table to support EDAM transfers, and that an equitable solution is to share that value equally. I disagree with you about the way you're characterizing the transfers on these major interties. In my mind, the transfers on these major interties, they are the most important transfers that we're talking about in terms of the EDAM footprint, because they're effectively the backbone of the Western grid. You have, like I said before, 8,000 megawatts of potential transfer capability supporting value between these two regions, and you have entities that are funding those lines on the different segments of those jointly coordinated and operated paths. It just does not make sense to me to do anything other than recognize that and say, we want that transmission in the market, we want it to be optimized, and we want the value to be returned to the entities funding those joint facilities. And all of the details here and all of the complexity, first of all, like I said, it's really hard to understand what it will lead to. But the second, when we look at the details of this, we feel very confident that it will lead to an inequitable result, and I just don't understand the rationale for that when there's a more straightforward approach that would be clear and transparent and durable for everybody. So I just disagree with the way you're characterizing this, and I continue to not understand what the rationale is.
Jeff, I hear you, and it really sounds like what we need to do is potentially take this off offline whether or not we need to have another workshop or something and to dive into these details further. What I can ask right now is that you put some of this in writing so that we can, when we do have this discussion, we can, dive in depth. And maybe it's going to be a work group, maybe it'll be just a one-off conversation. But I'd like to leave a little time for April to address her stuff too. But I appreciate all your comments, Jeff.
Thanks, James.
Yeah. I apologize. I wish we had more time, but. So now what I'm going to do is briefly, because we are running out of time, briefly cover the other two sets of scenarios. So basically, in this scenario, I've created a situation where the intertie constraint itself finds generator 4 has been derated. It can only provide a total of 250 megawatts at $30. So therefore, it doesn't have additional energy that it can send over. My ATC limit has been expanded. That means they now have 300 megawatts to send if they were available to send it. And additionally, the ITC has been derated to ensure that it can only accept 300 megawatts across these competing locations, the transfer limit as well as the bid-in location for the intertie. If we go to the slide, next slide, you'll see that BAB's price, the marginal energy price, has gone from $30 to $50. That's because the next marginal cost of energy is actually going to be a BAA. It's going to be set by the intertie schedule at $50. The ETSR is no longer binding because we've used up the maximum amount of transfer capability of the resources within BAB, not the limit. But the ITC ISL is binding. So now what that's created is I now have 300 megawatts of energy that is being priced at $50 importing into the BAA. But for BAA, the marginal energy cost for energy within that is $60. The generation being paid $60, the load's paying $60. So I've now collected $10 of congestion revenue based upon the 300 megawatts of energy, and that is congestion revenue that can be distributed within BAA. The next set of slides creates a scenario where they're both binding. I wish I could have more time into addressing this, but basically the ITC ISL is at 300, the ATC limit at 200. I've got maximum transfer capability out of BAB to BAA because of the ATC limit. The transfer limit is binding. I also have 200 megawatts available at the intertie, but I can only use 100 megawatts of that because 200 is being used by the ETSR. So now the ITC is also binding. So now I have a price separation both for energy as well as congestion. So if I go to the next slide real quick, you'll see that I have $3,000 of congestion revenues collected at $10 times the 300 megawatts, 100 megawatts of import, 200 megawatts of a transfer that is going to serve internal load. But I also have a price separation between the BAAs of $20. So I'm also collecting transfer revenue that is going to be distributed 50-50 between the two BAAs. Now, I believe this is kind of going into a little bit of the direction that Jeff was discussing, but as I said, we'll probably have to have some further discussions later on. If we can go to the next slide. Now, the direction we're going with the proposal that we put it out was informed by stakeholders' comments and workshop discussions. Obviously, based upon these discussions, we are going to have more information that we're going to have utilized for the draft final proposal. But it does recognize the shared value that results when two EDAM EDAM entities bring transmission to a transfer location, including the ISL, and equally sharing the mutual benefit of that transfer, I believe is fair and equitable. I believe the future discussions will address this question. And we recognize that internal congestion associated with internal constraints should stay within the BA winner model. Now, I'm going to wrap up here, and I'm going to give it to April so that she can address some fees, and I apologize to April for not giving her a whole lot of time.
So you'll want to make sure you're unmuted on the WebEx as well.
Thanks, Isabella, and thanks, James. All right, folks, I'll go ahead and take you through to the EDAM fees framework. To kick it off, we'll touch upon the implementation agreement and the implementation fee, and then we'll move over to the EDAM administrative fees. Now, for the implementation agreement, this would be very similar to what we have used with the Western EIM implementation agreement. The agreement will lay out the terms of the implementation, and it'll also include our pricing and potential refunds surrounding the implementation. The implementation is going to be charged at cost of service. For preliminary purposes, we used a well-rounded amount of $200 per hour to come up with an average cost of about $1.2 million. That's roughly 6,000 hours of work for this implementation. Now, that was only for the $200 an hour was only used for preliminary purposes. For the actual cost, we would be using actual rates per hour for the employees that are working on the projects. The implementation is going to include much like with the WEIM implementation, it's going to include work from the project management team. We have a group of administrative management folks working on it as well. It'll include the full network modeling team, system integration and functional testing, metering and settlements, as well as operations readiness and training. Next slide, please. Okay, for the administrative fees portion, we are proposing to use our existing market services charge, and then we will also create an EDAM system operations charge. Now, the system operations charge will be assessed on the gross volumes that are generated as part of EDAM. Under this proposed fee structure, all customers that are receiving the market services will benefit from the lower market services charge. And that's because we would be using the additional EDAM day-ahead volumes to generate that rate. So with the additional volumes, that's going to cause the rates to go down. This would be a win-win for the ISO Balance Authority area, as well as for the EDAM participants. With that, are there any questions?
There's a question in the chat, April. Are these fees by EDAM, BAA, or SC?
The fees would be assessed on the schedule coordinator.
Okay, thank you. I'm not seeing any other questions.
Okay. The one thing I wanted to also point out, and I forgot to do so earlier, was that should an EDAM participant come on board with EDAM, they would no longer be charged their WEIM rates. So they would just be transitioning from WEIM system operations and market services rates over to the full market services rate and then the EDAM system operations rate.
Okay, looks like we have one caller in queue. Can we go to Lindsay? Can we unmute Lindsay Schleckway?
Hi, Lindsay Schluckler with NP Energy. I just have it's a slightly related question, but kind of not. One of the proposals for the EDAM was that all resources must be participating. And with that proposal, I was wondering if there would be any required metering upgrades to become participating resources.
That is a good question, and I don't have an answer for you at this time. If you can submit a question as part of the stakeholder feedback, we can go ahead and get that answer to you.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, I'm not seeing any other questions. All right, thanks, April.
Thank you, Isabel.
Okay, so now we are going to move into next steps, and I'm going to hand it over to John Anders here in just a moment to discuss the EDAM tariff framework, which we're planning to publish tomorrow, which will be our next step. So John, I'll hand it over to you, and you can briefly describe that.
Thanks, Isabella. Can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you.
Okay, good. Yeah, so I won't spend much of any time on this, but tomorrow we will be publishing as a first step in the sort of the tariff stakeholder process, what we're calling an outline. So it's an outline of the revised straw proposal in sort of a tariff format. There's an introductory section which explains, its purpose and scope and all that. So I won't go through that. But really what this is doing is sort of kicking off this process. And then when we get through the draft final proposal, we'll update this outline into a more complete framework of the tariff. And then it'll be more similar to what we published in the WEIM stakeholder initiative. And this then will then inform stakeholders and ourselves as far as publication of the draft tariff language, which will follow after the final proposal and consideration by the WEIM and the California ISO governing board. So that's the process. We're looking forward to it. You're welcome to submit any comments or questions in your stakeholder comments on the revised straw proposal September 26th. But for this outline, we just kind of wanted to socialize it, and we're not really contemplating a formal comment period associated with this. We'll do that for the full tariff framework we're going to publish in November so that we have a good sense of things going into the draft tariff language early next year. But for now, we just wanted to socialize it. So you're welcome to, make comments, but we don't expect, and we're not going to have a separate comment period for this outline. And that's it, Isabella. If there's any questions, happy to answer that, but we're done with this next step.
All right. Thanks, John. And I'm not seeing any questions, so I will hand it back to Milos.
Thank you, Isabella. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
All right. And again, just want to express our gratitude to the stakeholder community that's had a chance to jump on this call this morning. I know there's a DAME call a bit later in the afternoon, so a busy day for everybody. So thank you all for joining us. I think one thing that's emerging from this discussion, particularly on this last discussion on transfer revenue, is the need for some additional workshops, and we're going to look to schedule that in short order and maybe walk through some real-life examples, walk particularly through a PDCI example, but also illustrate the concept of the ITC, that intertie transmission constraint that other balancing authority areas may have in other scenarios, and really discuss through what's the appropriate allocation in those scenarios. So we'll look to schedule something in short order because I think that's clear that the additional discussions are needed on that. But really just want to thank again everybody. We have a couple of settlements workshops scheduled for October 5th and the 6th. Those are in our calendar. We're going to notice them, I think, later this week. And then we look forward to your comments that are due on the 26th. Based on the last few discussions, I think there's been requests for additional workshops in other areas. Once the comments come in, we'll look to consolidate those and just identify more broadly where would there be benefit for additional workshops. But I think settlements and transfer revenue are a couple of clear candidates, and then we'll identify based on comments some additional areas as well. But thank you again, everybody, for participating, and I'll turn it over to you, Isabella, just to close us out.
Thanks, Milos. And my last reminders are just the stakeholder symposium. So we are excited to be hosting again for the first time in 4 years this November 9th and 10th at the Safe Credit Union Convention Center in downtown Sacramento. So if you have not registered for the symposium yet, I encourage you to do so. You can find the registration by going to CAISO.com, stay informed, and then it'll take you to the stakeholder symposium webpage. And on that page, you will also see that we do have sponsorship opportunities available. So if your organization is interested in sponsoring the symposium, then you can find more information on that stakeholder symposium page under sponsors and sponsorships. But with that, that closes out today's EDAM stakeholder meeting. Thank you all for joining us and have a great rest of your day.
That concludes our conference. Thank you for using Event Services. You may now disconnect.